Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Chapter 1. A Stranger Arrives. The morning mist had barely lifted from the gardens of St. Mary Mead when Miss Jane Marple first observed the motor car proceeding with unusual determination down the high street. It was not the sedate pace of Dr. Haydock making his rounds, nor the familiar rhythm of the baker's van, but something altogether more purposeful that caught her attention as she tended to her roses. From her cottage window, Miss Marple watched with the keen interest that village life had trained in her over many decades. The motor car, a sensible black Austin, drew to a halt outside Messrs. Dalglish and Company, the local bank that had been the talk of the village for these past 3 weeks. Ever since that peculiar business of the robbery, such an extraordinary thing to happen in St. Mary Mead, where the most exciting occurrence was usually Mrs. Price Ridley's disputes with the grocer. The driver who emerged was immediately fascinating to Miss Marple's practised eye. A young woman, perhaps 35, with an air of unmistakable authority that spoke of London rather than the countryside. Her costume was severely practical, a well-tailored grey coat and skirt that suggested both professionalism and a certain impatience with feminine fripperies. She moved with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to command, her leather portfolio clutched firmly as she surveyed the modest frontage of the bank. "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple to herself, noting the way the stranger's gaze swept the street with the methodical attention of someone trained to observe. There was something in her bearing that reminded Miss Marple of her nephew Raymond's wife. That particular combination of intelligence and slight condescension that came from dealing with what one considered inferior minds. Inspector Sarah Hartwell, for such was the stranger's name, though Miss Marple was not yet privy to this information, stood for a moment outside the bank consulting a leather-bound notebook. She had driven down from London at an uncommonly early hour, having received word that the local constabulary had made little progress in what Scotland Yard considered a rather sophisticated crime for such a provincial setting. The robbery itself had been executed with a precision that bordered on the artistic. No violence, no dramatics, simply the quiet removal of a considerable sum during the lunch hour when the bank was minimally staffed. The technique suggested urban expertise, yet the perpetrator had vanished as completely as morning dew, leaving behind only the most tantalizingly insufficient clues. Miss Marple observed as the young woman produced what appeared to be a camera, one of those modern contraptions that she had seen her great-nephew use during his visit last summer. The stranger began photographing the bank's exterior with systematic thoroughness, moving from various angles as if conducting some form of scientific survey. Most methodical, Miss Marple reflected, remembering how her late husband's surveyor had once examined their property boundaries with similar precision. Though I do wonder if she might not be missing the forest for the trees, as dear Raymond would say. The arrival of Mr. Pemberton, the bank manager, provided Miss Marple with an excellent opportunity to observe the interaction between her subjects. Mr. Pemberton, a gentleman of nervous disposition who had been quite overwhelmed by recent events, emerged from the bank with the eager deference of someone greeting a saviour. "Inspector Hartwell, I presume?" His voice carried clearly across the quiet street. "I cannot tell you how relieved we are to have Scotland Yard take an interest. The local police, I'm afraid, well, one doesn't wish to criticise, but their methods seem rather old-fashioned for this sort of sophisticated crime." The young woman's response was crisp and authoritative. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports, Mr. Pemberton. I must say I'm surprised that a crime of this nature hasn't been resolved already. The application of proper scientific detection methods should make short work of it." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly at this confident pronouncement. She had witnessed many investigations over the years, some successful, others less so, and had learned that human nature possessed complexities that often confounded even the most scientific approaches. The inspector and bank manager disappeared into the building, but not before Miss Marple had observed several telling details. The young woman's shoes, though sensible, showed the kind of wear that suggested long hours of standing, a professional habit perhaps. Her manner with Mr. Pemberton was courteous but faintly impatient, the attitude of someone accustomed to dealing with what she considered amateur enthusiasm. Rather like young Dr. Morrison, Miss Marple mused, recalling the physician who had briefly practised in the village some years ago. So very certain that his modern methods were superior to old Dr. Haydock's bedside manner, though I seem to remember that he left rather suddenly after that unfortunate misdiagnosis of Mrs. Carmichael's condition. The morning continued with the inspector emerging periodically to photograph various aspects of the crime scene. Her methodology was impressive, measuring distances, examining angles, making detailed notes. She appeared to be reconstructing the sequence of events with the precision of a clockmaker reassembling a timepiece. When Constable Polk arrived, looking rather flustered and uncertain, Miss Marple was treated to another illuminating exchange. "I trust you've preserved the scene exactly as requested," the inspector inquired. "Well, ma'am, we did our best, but you see—" "Inspector Hartwell, and I assume by best you mean following proper forensic protocols." Poor Constable Polk's expression suggested that forensic protocols were about as familiar to him as Egyptian hieroglyphics. Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for the good man, who had served St. Mary Mead faithfully for many years without ever encountering anything more complex than bicycle theft or the occasional domestic dispute. By afternoon, the inspector had established herself as a formidable presence. Miss Marple, taking her constitutional walk past the bank, observed that several villagers had gathered to watch this metropolitan efficiency in action. Mrs. Price Ridley was holding forth to anyone who would listen about the superiority of London detectives, while young Dr. Haydock appeared rather sceptical of the proceedings. "All very scientific, I'm sure," he was saying to Colonel Bantry, "but I've always found that understanding people is rather more important than understanding evidence." Miss Marple paused to adjust her glove, the better to overhear the conversation. "Nonsense, Haydock," Colonel Bantry replied. "What we need is modern methods. Can't solve crimes with intuition and village gossip these days." "Can't you indeed?" Miss Marple murmured to herself, remembering several recent occasions when village gossip had proved remarkably illuminating. How very interesting that people should be so eager to dismiss what has served us well for so many years. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple found herself in a curious state of mind. She felt genuine admiration for the young inspector's thoroughness and professional competence, yet she could not quite suppress a mild feeling of displacement. For many years the villagers had looked to her when matters required investigation, and while she had never sought such a role, she had grown accustomed to being consulted when mysteries arose. The inspector's casual dismissal of traditional methods stung more than Miss Marple cared to admit. She had solved several rather complex matters through careful observation of human nature and attention to the seemingly insignificant details that revealed so much about character and motivation. Perhaps, she reflected as she prepared her simple supper, there is room for both approaches in this world, though I suspect that young woman may discover that human nature is rather more complex than her scientific methods account for. The evening brought news through Mrs. Bantry's telephone call that the inspector had taken rooms at the Blue Boar and was reportedly very pleased with her preliminary investigations. "She seems most confident," Mrs. Bantry reported. "Says she expects to have the matter wrapped up within the week using proper modern detective work." "How very reassuring," Miss Marple replied gently, "though I do hope she won't overlook the importance of understanding the local community. Villages, you know, are rather like families, full of undercurrents and connections that might not be immediately apparent to an outsider." That night, as Miss Marple settled into her comfortable chair with her knitting, she found herself wondering what the morning would bring. She had lived long enough to know that confidence, however justified, could sometimes prove to be a rather fragile thing when confronted with the unexpected complexities of human behaviour. The arrival of Inspector Sarah Hartwell had certainly disturbed the quiet routine of St Mary Mead, but Miss Marple suspected that the real disturbances were yet to come. Chapter 2: The Missing Church Silver. The morning of young Timothy Fletcher's wedding to Miss Sarah Mills dawned with that particular quality of light that seemed to bless such occasions in St Mary Mead. Miss Marple, adjusting her best hat before the looking-glass, reflected that weddings possessed a peculiar ability to reveal character in ways that ordinary circumstances seldom managed. People she had observed became rather more themselves at weddings, whether that proved fortunate or otherwise. The Church of St Mary the Virgin presented a charming picture as the morning progressed. Mrs Fletcher, the groom's mother, had outdone herself with the floral arrangements, though Miss Marple detected a certain nervous energy in the way she repeatedly adjusted the altar flowers. Young Timothy, she noticed, bore the slightly bewildered expression common to bridegrooms, as if he could not quite comprehend how he'd arrived at this particular moment. Miss Marple positioned herself in her accustomed pew, from which vantage point she could observe both the ceremony and the congregation with equal facility. The bride, she noted with approval, looked genuinely radiant rather than merely fashionable, always a promising sign in Miss Marple's estimation. Inspector Hartwell's presence in the church struck Miss Marple as mildly surprising. The young woman sat towards the back, her notebook discreetly concealed, but her observant gaze suggesting she viewed the gathering as much from a professional as a social perspective. Miss Marple wondered if the inspector's attendance might indicate a broader interest in the community she was temporarily serving. The ceremony proceeded with the beautiful solemnity that the Anglican service provided. Miss Marple found herself remembering her own dear husband's reverent participation in such occasions, and how he had always maintained that weddings were among God's finest opportunities to observe the human heart at its most hopeful. It was during the hymn "Love Divine, All Loves Excelling" that the first sign of disturbance manifested itself. Miss Marple, whose attention had been momentarily drawn to the way young Dr. Haydock was regarding the proceedings with unusual gravity, noticed the Reverend Clement's sudden expression of concern as he moved towards the vestry. The service continued without apparent interruption, but Miss Marple observed that the vicar returned with a distinctly troubled countenance. His performance of the remainder of the ceremony, while perfectly adequate, lacked the joyful assurance that typically characterized his conduct of such occasions. The recessional proceeded normally, with the happy couple and their attendants making their way down the aisle, to the enthusiastic approval of the congregation. Miss Marple joined the general movement towards the church door, but lingered to observe the various social interactions that wedding celebrations invariably produced. It was young Timothy's uncle, Mr. George Fletcher, who first raised the alarm. His voice, trained by years of addressing agricultural meetings, carried clearly across the churchyard. "I say, Vicar, there seems to be some sort of difficulty with the vestry." The Reverend Clement's response was barely audible, but his expression conveyed considerable distress. Miss Marple, positioning herself with the innocent casualness of someone examining the memorial plaques, was able to overhear his explanation to Mr. Fletcher. "The communion silver appears to be missing. The complete set, chalice, paten and ciborium. Most distressing, particularly on such an occasion." The news spread through the congregation with the peculiar rapidity that characterizes village communications. Mrs. Price Ridley immediately declared it perfectly shocking, while Colonel Bantry wondered aloud whether proper security precautions had been observed. Inspector Hartwell's response was immediate and professional. She approached the vicar with the brisk efficiency that Miss Marple had observed the previous day, her notebook already in hand. "I shall need to examine the scene immediately," she announced, "and I must request that no one else enter the vestry until I've completed my preliminary investigation." Miss Marple watched with interest as the inspector took charge of the situation. Within minutes she had cordoned off the vestry area and begun her systematic examination of the scene. Her photography equipment appeared with remarkable efficiency, and she set about documenting the crime scene with the same methodical precision she had applied to the bank robbery. The wedding party, meanwhile, found themselves in the rather awkward position of celebrating while a crime investigation proceeded in their immediate vicinity. Young Mrs. Fletcher, Miss Marple still thought of her as Sarah Mills, displayed admirable composure under the circumstances, though her new husband appeared somewhat overwhelmed by the unexpected drama. "Most distressing for the young couple," murmured Mrs. Bantry to Miss Marple as they observed the proceedings. "Though I must say that inspector seems to know exactly what she's about." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, she appears most competent, though I do wonder whether she might benefit from understanding the particular significance of the stolen items to this community." The inspector's interview process was impressively systematic. She had established herself at a small table outside the vestry door and was conducting individual conversations with each wedding guest, recording their responses with meticulous care. Miss Marple observed that her questions focused primarily on movements during the ceremony and observations of unusual behaviour. When Miss Marple's turn arrived, she found Inspector Hartwell to be courteous, but somewhat dismissive of what she clearly regarded as an elderly witness, whose observations were likely to be both confused and irrelevant. "Miss Marple, I believe? I understand you're something of a local expert on village affairs." The tone was polite but carried a subtle suggestion of patronisation that Miss Marple had encountered before from younger persons who equated age with diminished capability. "I have lived here for many years," Miss Marple replied gently. "One does notice things, you know, when one has observed the same community for so long." "Quite. Now, during the ceremony, did you observe anyone behaving unusually or leaving their seat at any point?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "Several people moved about during the service, as is quite natural. Mrs. Fletcher checked the flowers twice. Maternal anxiety, you understand. Young Dr. Haydock stepped out during the second hymn, though he returned promptly. Colonel Bantry appeared to be having some difficulty with his hearing aid. Inspector Hartwell noted these observations with professional efficiency, but Miss Marple detected a certain impatience in her manner, as if she were merely fulfilling a procedural obligation rather than gathering genuinely useful intelligence. "And did you notice anything unusual about the vestry area itself?" "The door was closed throughout the ceremony, as is customary, though I did observe that the Reverend seemed rather concerned when he went to check something during the hymn singing." "Yes, that would be when he discovered the theft. Anything else?" Miss Marple hesitated momentarily. There had been something, a subtle impression that nagged at her consciousness like a half-remembered tune. But Inspector Hartwell's brisk efficiency discouraged the kind of reflective observation that Miss Marple had found most valuable in her previous encounters with mysterious events. "Nothing specific, Inspector. Though I do think it rather significant that the theft occurred during such a public gathering. It suggests either considerable boldness or intimate knowledge of when attention would be elsewhere." Inspector Hartwell made a perfunctory note. "Yes. Well, criminals often display a certain opportunistic cunning. Thank you, Miss Marple. I may have additional questions later." As Miss Marple moved away from the interview table, she found herself feeling rather dismissed, a sensation she recognised but had not experienced for some time. The inspector's confidence in her modern methods was absolute, but Miss Marple wondered whether such confidence might prove premature. The wedding reception, relocated to the village hall due to the circumstances, proceeded with determined cheerfulness despite the shadow cast by the theft, and Miss Marple attended primarily to observe, noting the various undercurrents of emotion that such events invariably produced. Inspector Hartwell appeared periodically, consulting with Constable Polk and examining various pieces of evidence in small, transparent envelopes. Her scientific approach was undeniably impressive, and several villagers commented admiringly on her professional expertise. "Makes our local difficulties seem rather amateurish, doesn't it?" remarked Mr. Pemberton to anyone who would listen. "Proper detective work, this. None of that old-fashioned intuition nonsense." Miss Marple, overhearing this comment while helping Mrs. Fletcher with the tea arrangements, felt a familiar stirring of the gentle determination that had served her well in previous mysteries. Perhaps it was time to apply her own methods of observation to the problem at hand, regardless of whether those methods met with official approval. As the afternoon progressed, she began to notice details that seemed to have escaped Inspector Hartwell's systematic attention, small human interactions and emotional responses that might prove more illuminating than photographic evidence or fingerprint analysis. The theft of the church silver was certainly a crime requiring solution, but Miss Marple suspected that the human elements of the mystery might prove rather more complex than scientific detection methods could readily accommodate. Chapter 3: Modern Methods versus Old Wisdom. The following morning brought with it the particular quality of anticipation that follows dramatic events in small communities. Miss Marple, taking her customary early walk through the village, observed that St. Mary Mead had acquired an almost festive air of excitement quite at odds with the gravity of the crimes under investigation. At the post office, Mrs. Jameson was holding forth to a small gathering about the superiority of London detection methods, while outside the Blue Boar, Inspector Hartwell could be observed loading various items of scientific equipment into a motor car with the brisk efficiency of a military operation. Miss Marple paused to examine the notice board, a vantage point that afforded an excellent view of the inspector's preparations. The young woman had apparently acquired a considerable array of investigative apparatus since her arrival. Photographic equipment of various descriptions, what appeared to be a microscope in a leather case, and several boxes labelled with mysterious scientific terminology. "Most impressive," murmured Miss Marple to herself, though she could not quite suppress the reflection that her late nephew's wife had displayed similar confidence in modern educational methods when attempting to reform the village school, an endeavour that had foundered somewhat upon the discovery that children possessed human nature rather than mechanical predictability. The inspector's methodology, as it unfolded over the course of the morning, was undeniably systematic. Miss Marple, whose constitutional walk happened to take her past the church at regular intervals, observed the meticulous process of evidence-gathering that Inspector Hartwell applied to the vestry. Every surface was examined with what appeared to be a magnifying glass of considerable power. Photographs were taken from numerous angles, and various small items were carefully collected in labelled envelopes. The inspector's notebook filled with observations recorded in the neat, precise handwriting of someone accustomed to preparing official reports. When Constable Polk arrived to assist, Miss Marple was treated to an illuminating demonstration of modern police procedure. "Have you completed the fingerprint analysis of the door handles?" Inspector Hartwell inquired. Poor Pelk's expression suggested that fingerprint analysis ranked somewhere beyond his professional capabilities, along with telephonic communications and the mysteries of motorcar maintenance. "Well, Inspector, we don't precisely have the equipment for that sort of thing, you see, but I did dust about a bit with some powder that Dr. Haydock lent me." Inspector Hartwell's response was a model of professional patience tinged with barely concealed exasperation. "I see. Well, fortunately I've brought proper forensic supplies from London. We shall need to start again, I'm afraid, using correct scientific procedures." Miss Marple, who was ostensibly admiring the memorial roses but actually attending carefully to this exchange, found herself reminded of young Mr. Peterson's attempts to modernise the village telephone system. The poor man had been so convinced that technical excellence would overcome local peculiarities, until the discovery that Mrs. Price Ridley's domestic arrangements included a parrot with an unfortunate tendency to mimic dial tones. The contrast between Inspector Hartwell's approach and the investigation methods traditionally employed in St. Mary Mead became increasingly apparent as the morning progressed. Where local difficulties had typically been resolved through careful attention to personal relationships and individual psychology, the inspector applied what she clearly regarded as objective scientific analysis. Miss Marple encountered a perfect illustration of this divergence when she paused to speak with Mrs. Fletcher, who was still somewhat overwrought by the disruption of her son's wedding day. "It's all very distressing, Miss Marple. That beautiful silver, blessed by 3 generations of vicars, simply vanished during dear Timothy's ceremony. Inspector Hartwell has been most thorough, but I cannot help feeling that she doesn't quite understand what those pieces meant to our community." Before Miss Marple could respond, Inspector Hartwell herself appeared, having apparently concluded her examination of the vestry. "Mrs. Fletcher, I wonder if I might ask you a few additional questions about the church silver. The insurance valuation suggests considerable worth. That would certainly provide adequate motive for theft." "Oh, but Inspector, it wasn't the monetary value that mattered. Those pieces were consecrated by Bishop Marlowe himself in 1887. My own dear mother served communion wine from that very chalice when she was confirmed." Inspector Hartwell made a note, but her expression suggested she regarded sentimental attachments as irrelevant complications rather than potentially illuminating clues. "Yes, I understand the items had historical significance. However, modern thieves are typically motivated by resale value rather than emotional considerations. My analysis of similar crimes suggests we're dealing with someone familiar with ecclesiastical silver markets." Miss Marple observed this exchange with growing interest. The inspector's confident dismissal of human sentiment reminded her rather forcibly of that unfortunate incident involving Mr. Thompson's prize roses. The poor man had applied the most scientific fertilizing methods available, quite ignoring old Mr. Briggs's gentle suggestion that roses, like people, sometimes required understanding rather than mere technical expertise. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Inspector Hartwell outside Dalgleish and Company, where the young woman was conducting what appeared to be a photographic survey of the surrounding buildings. "Good afternoon, Inspector. I trust your investigations are proceeding satisfactorily." Inspector Hartwell looked up from her camera with the slightly impatient expression of someone interrupted during important work. "Miss Marple, yes, quite satisfactorily, thank you. I'm documenting potential escape routes and surveillance points. Modern criminal investigation requires comprehensive environmental analysis." "How very thorough. I couldn't help noticing your scientific equipment earlier. Such impressive apparatus for a small village investigation." "Crime is crime, Miss Marple, regardless of the setting. The application of proper forensic techniques is essential for reliable results. Too often, rural investigations rely on speculation and local gossip rather than objective evidence." Miss Marple's smile remained perfectly gentle, though she felt a familiar stirring of what her dear husband had diplomatically termed her sense of natural justice. "How very true, Inspector. Though I have sometimes found that understanding why people behave as they do can be quite as illuminating as understanding what they have done." Inspector Hartwell's response carried the patient tone typically reserved for well-meaning but misguided elderly persons. "Psychology certainly has its place, but modern detection relies on scientific verification rather than amateur character analysis. Physical evidence doesn't lie, Miss Marple, whereas human interpretation is notoriously unreliable." As Miss Marple continued her walk home, she found herself reflecting upon the curious confidence that technical training seemed to inspire in young people. Inspector Hartwell's faith in her methods was absolute, yet Miss Marple could not quite suppress the feeling that human nature possessed complexities that scientific analysis might struggle to accommodate. That evening, as she settled into her comfortable chair with her knitting, Miss Marple allowed her mind to wander over the details of both crimes. The bank robbery and the church silver theft appeared unconnected, yet something in the precision of both suggested a common element that purely technical investigation might overlook. The inspector's methods were undoubtedly impressive, but Miss Marple suspected that the solutions to St. Mary Mead's mysteries might require a rather different kind of understanding than scientific equipment could provide. Chapter 4, The First Victory. The resolution of the church silver mystery came with the swift precision that characterized Inspector Hartwell's professional methodology. Miss Marple, returning from her afternoon shopping expedition, to find the village positively humming with excitement, learned the particulars from Mrs. Bantry, who had witnessed the dramatic conclusion from her vantage point in the church porch. "My dear Jane, you should have seen it," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, her eyes bright with the particular satisfaction that comes from observing competence triumphant. That clever inspector simply laid out her photographs like a puzzle, showing exactly who could have been where during the ceremony. Quite brilliant, really. Miss Marple settled herself more comfortably in Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, accepting the offered tea with the gentle attentiveness that encouraged confidences. How very methodical of her. I confess myself curious about the details. Well, you see, she had photographed everyone during the service, quite unobtrusively, mind you, and then she compared those images with the timing of the hymns and responses. Apparently, there was only one moment when the vestry could have been accessed without observation, and only 3 people who moved during that precise interval. Mrs. Bantry paused dramatically, rather in the manner of someone who has saved the best revelation for last. It was young Dr. Morrison's locum, that rather intense fellow who's been filling in while Morrison visits his sister. Dr. Pemberton, I believe his name is. The inspector proved he had both opportunity and knowledge of the church layout. Miss Marple's needle paused momentarily in her embroidery. Dr. Pemberton? But surely a medical man would hardly require stolen silver. Gambling debts, my dear. Quite shocking, really. The inspector discovered that he owed considerable sums to some rather unsavoury characters in London. When confronted with her evidence, timestamps from her photographs cross-referenced with a hymnal progression, he confessed immediately. The account as Mrs. Bantry related it spoke to Inspector Hartwell's undeniable competence. The young woman had identified the crucial moments during Jerusalem the Golden when the congregation's attention was entirely focused upon the altar, cross-referenced this with photographic evidence of individual movements, and systematically eliminated all suspects save one. Most impressive methodology, Miss Marple observed thoughtfully. Rather like that time when Mr. Henderson's prize orchids disappeared from the greenhouse. Young Mr. Peterson applied similar logical elimination to identify the culprit, though in that case, I believe the solution lay more in understanding why someone desperately needed prize-winning flowers than in determining who had access to the greenhouse. Mrs. Bantry nodded enthusiastically. Exactly so, though I must say, Inspector Hartwell's approach was remarkably efficient. No messy emotional complications or village gossip, just clear, objective evidence leading to an undeniable conclusion. As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, she found herself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions. Genuine admiration for Inspector Hartwell's technical skill warred with a curious sense of diminishment that she recognised but had not experienced for some considerable time. The inspector's success had been achieved through methods entirely foreign to Miss Marple's own approach. Where she might have spent weeks gently observing human interactions and listening to the subtle undercurrents of village life, Inspector Hartwell had employed photographic analysis and systematic timing to achieve a resolution within days. Yet something in the neat efficiency of the solution troubled Miss Marple's instincts. Not the accuracy. Dr. Pemberton had indeed confessed, and his gambling difficulties provided adequate motive. Rather, it was the absence of what her dear husband had always termed the human element that left her feeling oddly unsatisfied. The following morning brought confirmation of Inspector Hartwell's growing reputation. The local newspaper, delivered by young Tommy Pierce with evident excitement, featured a prominent article titled "Modern Detection Triumphs in Historic Village." The piece praised the inspector's scientific methodology and professional efficiency in terms that seemed to diminish the village's previous approaches to problem-solving. Miss Marple read the article with careful attention, noting the subtle implications about amateur detection and outdated methods that peppered the journalist's prose. The inspector herself was quoted extensively on the superiority of objective analysis over subjective speculation. Most gratifying for the young woman, Miss Marple murmured to herself, though she could not entirely suppress a wry smile at the journalist's evident fascination with urban sophistication triumphing over rural simplicity. The inspector's enhanced status became apparent when Miss Marple encountered her outside the post office later that morning. Inspector Hartwell acknowledged her with the courteous but slightly patronising manner of someone who had recently proven the superiority of her methods. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I trust you've heard about the resolution of the church silver case." "Indeed, Inspector, Mrs. Bantry was most eloquent in her description of your methodology. Such a satisfactory conclusion." Inspector Hartwell's smile suggested modest satisfaction with deserved recognition. Modern forensic techniques do tend to cut through the confusion that surrounds rural investigations. When one applies proper scientific principles, solutions become rather more straightforward than traditional methods might suggest. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "How very true, though I confess myself curious about Dr. Pemberton's particular circumstances. Such a desperate step for a professional man. One wonders what pressures might have driven him to such extremity." "Gambling addiction requires little explanation, Miss Marple. The psychology is well documented. Once debt reaches a certain threshold, criminal behaviour becomes statistically predictable." The inspector's dismissal of psychological complexity struck Miss Marple as reminiscent of young Mr. Whitfield's approach to village politics. The poor man had been so confident that logical argument would resolve the controversy over the church fete location, quite overlooking the fact that Mrs. Price Ridley's opposition stemmed from a 20-year-old slight involving the flower arrangement competition. As the day progressed, Miss Marple observed the subtle changes that success had wrought in Inspector Hartwell's bearing. The young woman moved through the village with increased confidence, accepting congratulations with gracious professionalism while maintaining her superior attitude toward local detection methods. Several villagers approached Miss Marple with comments that, while well-intentioned, carried uncomfortable implications about the obsolescence of her own occasional involvement in mysterious matters. "Wonderful to have proper expertise available," remarked Colonel Bantry. "None of this intuition nonsense, just hard facts and scientific analysis." Miss Marple's response was characteristically gentle. "Indeed, Colonel, though I have always found that understanding why people behave as they do can be quite as important as determining what they have done." That evening, as Miss Marple tended her garden in the fading light, she reflected upon the day's events with characteristic honesty. Inspector Hartwell's success was genuine and deserved, achieved through competence and professionalism that commanded respect. Yet Miss Marple could not entirely dismiss the feeling that something essential had been overlooked in the pursuit of scientific efficiency. Human nature, in her experience, possessed complexities that technical analysis might struggle to accommodate, and she suspected that St. Mary Mead's mysteries were far from concluded. The inspector's confidence, however well-founded, reminded Miss Marple of her nephew Raymond's certainty about modern business methods, a confidence that had served him well until that unfortunate affair involving the expansion into European markets, where understanding local customs had proved rather more crucial than financial projections suggested. Time, Miss Marple reflected as she gathered her gardening tools, would doubtless provide its own education in the relative merits of old wisdom and new methods. Chapter 5. Sarah's Confidence. The week following Inspector Hartwell's triumph brought with it a subtle but unmistakable alteration in the social fabric of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, whose Morning Constitutional had for decades provided her with an accurate barometer of village sentiment, observed the change with the careful attention she might have devoted to the first signs of an approaching storm. The transformation was perhaps most evident at Dalgleish and Company, where Mr. Pemberton had taken to holding court each morning with a small but attentive audience of local worthies. His discourse invariably centred upon Inspector Hartwell's remarkable efficiency and the superiority of metropolitan detection methods over what he termed, with increasing boldness, the old-fashioned village approach to such matters. Miss Marple, collecting her modest pension and conducting the small financial transactions that village life required, found herself positioned to overhear these discussions with perfect propriety. Mr. Pemberton's enthusiasm was genuine, though she detected beneath it the particular satisfaction of a man who had backed the winning horse at sufficient odds to feel genuinely clever. "Mark my words, Colonel," she heard him declare to Colonel Bantry, "we've witnessed the dawn of a new era. No more fumbling about with hunches and village gossip. Scientific detection. That's the future of criminal investigation." Colonel Bantry's response carried the hearty agreement of someone who had always preferred straightforward military solutions to complex civilian problems. "Quite right, Pemberton. Amazing what proper training and modern equipment can accomplish." Miss Marple completed her transactions with the thoughtful deliberation that advancing years had made habitual, though her mind moved with considerably more agility than her measured pace might have suggested. The Colonel's enthusiasm reminded her rather forcibly of his confidence in that new agricultural machinery some years past, a confidence that had persisted until the unfortunate incident with Mrs. Hargreaves's prize poultry. The inspector herself had acquired a somewhat different bearing since her success. Miss Marple observed this transformation during their chance encounter outside Griggs' general store, where Inspector Hartwell was examining what appeared to be crime scene photographs with the proprietor. "Most fascinating, Inspector," Mr. Grigg was saying with the deference typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. "Such scientific precision in your methods." Inspector Hartwell accepted the compliment with gracious professionalism, though Miss Marple detected a subtle increase in confidence that bordered upon what her dear mother would have termed self-satisfaction. Modern forensic science does tend to eliminate the guesswork that has traditionally characterized rural investigations, the inspector replied. When one applies proper analytical techniques, solutions become rather more apparent than intuitive methods might suggest. Miss Marple approached with her customary gentle smile. "Good morning, Inspector. I trust your continuing investigations are proceeding satisfactorily." The inspector's acknowledgement carried the courteous but faintly condescending tone that successful professionals sometimes adopted toward well-meaning amateurs. "Miss Marple, yes, quite satisfactorily. I've been examining the bank robbery evidence with fresh perspective, applying the same systematic methodology that proved so effective with the church silver case." "How very thorough," Miss Marple observed mildly. "I confess myself curious whether the two crimes might bear any connection beyond their proximity in time." Inspector Hartwell's smile suggested patient tolerance for elderly speculation. "Criminal investigation requires evidence-based analysis rather than theoretical connections, Miss Marple. Each case must be evaluated on its individual merits using objective forensic principles." As Miss Marple continued her morning rounds, she encountered numerous variations of this same theme. The inspector's success had apparently confirmed certain villagers in their conviction that modern methods represented inevitable progress over traditional approaches to problem-solving. Mrs. Price Ridley, holding forth at the post office, was particularly emphatic on the subject. "High time we had proper professional assistance in such matters. I've always maintained that detection requires scientific training rather than amateur interference." Miss Marple received this pronouncement with the equanimity that long experience with Mrs. Price Ridley had taught her, though she could not entirely suppress the reflection that the lady's enthusiasm for professional expertise had been notably absent during that unfortunate affair involving her nephew's speculative investments. The most significant indication of Inspector Hartwell's enhanced status came through an article in the county newspaper, which young Tommy Pearce delivered with evident pride in St. Mary Mead's newfound notoriety. The piece, titled "The Young Detective Who Outshone a Legend," provided a detailed account of the inspector's methods, while drawing unflattering comparisons between scientific detection and what the journalist termed the declining tradition of amateur investigation. Miss Marple read the article with careful attention, noting the subtle implications embedded within the seemingly objective prose. The inspector was quoted extensively on the dangers of intuitive speculation and the necessity of rigorous professional standards in criminal investigation. Amateur detection, however well-intentioned, simply cannot compete with proper forensic training, Inspector Hartwell was reported as saying. Village mysteries require the same scientific rigour as urban crimes, perhaps more so given the tendency toward speculation and gossip in rural communities. The article's impact upon village opinion was immediate and pronounced. Miss Marple observed this shift during her afternoon visit to the lending library, where Mrs. Carmichael was discussing the piece with evident approval. "Such a relief to have genuine expertise available," Mrs. Carmichael declared, "though I suppose it does make one question the value of amateur involvement in such serious matters." Miss Marple selected her customary mystery novel with thoughtful deliberation. The authors she favoured, dependable writers, who understood that human nature possessed certain consistencies regardless of social change, provided comfort during periods of uncertainty. "Indeed," she replied gently, "though I have always found that understanding people's motivations can be quite as illuminating as understanding their actions." Mrs. Carmichael's response carried the slightly impatient tone of someone who had embraced modern thinking. "But surely, Miss Marple, scientific evidence provides more reliable guidance than psychological speculation." That evening, as Miss Marple settled into her comfortable chair with her knitting and the day's observations, she found herself experiencing emotions that her natural honesty compelled her to examine. The inspector's success was genuine and deserved, achieved through competence that commanded respect. Yet the accompanying dismissal of alternative approaches troubled Miss Marple's sense of proportion. She had never sought recognition for her occasional involvement in mysterious affairs, nor had she considered her methods superior to others. Rather, she had simply applied the understanding of human nature that village life had provided, supplemented by the careful observation that her dear husband had always encouraged. The inspector's growing confidence reminded Miss Marple of young Mr. Davidson's certainty about modern teaching methods, a confidence that had served him well until his encounter with Tommy Pierce's particular educational requirements, which had proved resistant to systematic pedagogical theory. As the lamplight cast familiar shadows across her sitting room, Miss Marple reflected that time possessed its own wisdom in such matters. Inspector Hartwell's methods were undoubtedly effective within their proper sphere, but human nature, in Miss Marple's experience, retained certain complexities that technical analysis might struggle to accommodate. The future would doubtless provide its own education in the relative merits of confidence and humility, scientific method and human understanding. Chapter 6. The Poisoned Garden Party. The afternoon of Colonel Bantry's garden party dawned with that peculiar quality of golden light that seemed to promise perfect English summer entertainment. Miss Marple, adjusting her second-best hat before the looking-glass, reflected that such occasions possessed an almost theatrical quality, as if the very perfection of the setting demanded some form of dramatic counterpoint to maintain nature's proper balance. Gossington Hall's gardens presented their finest aspect as the afternoon progressed. Mrs. Bantry had outdone herself with the arrangements, transforming the ancient lawns into an elegant tableau of pristine white marquees and precisely positioned tables. The effect was one of effortless sophistication, though Miss Marple's experienced eye detected the considerable planning that such apparent spontaneity required. The guest list represented the cream of local society, with Inspector Hartwell occupying a position of particular honour near the Colonel's prized herbaceous border. Miss Marple observed that the young woman had abandoned her customary severe costume in favour of a rather becoming summer frock, though her bearing retained that quality of professional alertness that seemed as natural to her as breathing. Mrs. Violet Pemberton, the bank manager's wife, appeared in especially fine form. Her recent elevation to social prominence, achieved through her husband's vocal support of Inspector Hartwell's methods, had lent her a confidence that manifested itself in animated conversation and frequent rather pointed laughter. Miss Marple positioned herself at a small table beneath the ancient oak tree, a vantage point that afforded excellent observation of the proceedings whilst maintaining the appearance of genteel retirement. The afternoon unfolded with the predictable rhythms of such gatherings, the careful choreography of social precedents, the subtle territorial negotiations that determined seating arrangements, and the particular quality of conversation that emerges when familiar acquaintances attempt to impress relative strangers. The cucumber sandwiches were, as always, exemplary. Mrs. Bantry's cook possessed that rare talent for achieving the perfect balance between delicate flavour and substantial satisfaction. Miss Marple noted with approval that Inspector Hartwell appeared to be enjoying herself, engaging in animated discussion with Dr. Haydock about the practical applications of scientific detection in rural communities. It was during the serving of the second course of refreshments that catastrophe struck, with the sudden violence that transforms pleasant social occasions into scenes of horror and confusion. Mrs. Pemberton, who had been holding forth with particular enthusiasm about the superiority of London society over provincial limitations, suddenly ceased speaking mid-sentence. Her face assumed an expression of profound bewilderment, followed by unmistakable distress. "I say," she managed to gasp, "I feel most peculiarly unwell." The words had scarcely left her lips when she collapsed forward onto the pristine white tablecloth, her teacup clattering to the ground with the terrible finality that accompanies irreversible disaster. Dr. Haydock reached her first, his professional training overriding the social paralysis that had frozen the other guests. His examination was swift but thorough, and the gravity of his expression communicated the situation's seriousness more eloquently than words might have managed. Inspector Hartwell's response was immediate and professional. Within moments, she had taken charge of the scene with the crisp efficiency that Miss Marple had come to associate with her character. The area around Mrs. Pemberton was cordoned off with improvised barriers, and guests were tactfully but firmly directed away from the immediate vicinity. "No one must touch anything," the inspector announced with quiet authority. "This is now a crime scene requiring proper forensic examination." Miss Marple observed these proceedings with the careful attention that such circumstances demanded. The transformation of Inspector Hartwell from social guest to investigating officer was remarkable in its completeness, as if she possessed an internal mechanism that could instantly reconfigure her entire being to meet professional requirements. Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination confirmed what the circumstances had already suggested. Mrs. Pemberton had succumbed to what appeared to be rapid poisoning, administered through substances that had acted with terrible swiftness. The symptoms were consistent with plant-based toxins, though the specific agent would require detailed laboratory analysis to determine. "Most distressing," murmured Colonel Bantry, his military bearing somewhat shaken by the unexpected drama. "Poor Violet! Such a shocking thing to happen at a garden party." Inspector Hartwell had already begun her systematic documentation of the scene. Her camera appeared with remarkable speed, and she commenced the methodical process of recording every aspect of the affected area: the teacup, the sandwich plate, the precise arrangement of objects on the table. All received the same meticulous attention that Miss Marple had observed during previous investigations. The guest interviews began immediately, conducted with the professional thoroughness that had characterized the inspector's approach to previous cases. Each person present was questioned about their observations, movements, and interactions with the deceased, their responses recorded in the inspector's precise handwriting. Miss Marple's own interview was conducted with the courteous efficiency she had come to expect from Inspector Hartwell. The young woman's questions focused primarily on factual observations: who had been seated where, what conversations had been overheard, any unusual behaviour that might have been noted. "You were seated with an excellent view of the proceedings, Miss Marple," the inspector observed. "Did you notice anything unusual about Mrs. Pemberton's behaviour before she collapsed?" Miss Marple considered the question with characteristic care. "She appeared in excellent spirits, Inspector, perhaps even more animated than usual. She had been discussing her recent visit to London with considerable enthusiasm." "And did you observe anyone approaching her table or handling her refreshments?" "Several people moved about during the afternoon, as is natural at such gatherings. The serving arrangements required considerable coordination, and various guests visited different tables to maintain social conversations." Inspector Hartwell noted these observations with professional attention, though Miss Marple detected a certain impatience in her manner, as if the complexities of social interaction represented unwelcome complications rather than potentially illuminating clues. As the afternoon progressed, the inspector's investigation revealed the methodical efficiency that had characterized her previous successes. The poisoned refreshments were identified and secured, potential witnesses were systematically interviewed, and the crime scene was documented with scientific precision. Yet Miss Marple observed certain details that seemed to escape the inspector's systematic attention. The subtle interplay of emotions among the guests, the particular ways certain individuals had responded to Mrs. Pemberton's collapse, the small but potentially significant reactions that revealed character under stress. These human elements appeared to interest Inspector Hartwell considerably less than the physical evidence she could photograph and analyse. As the investigation continued into the evening hours, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the curious contrast between scientific methodology and human understanding. The inspector's approach was undoubtedly thorough and professional, yet something in the neat efficiency of her process troubled Miss Marple's instincts about the complexities of human motivation. Chapter 7. The Young Detective Stumbles. The morning following Mrs. Pemberton's tragic demise brought with it the peculiar atmosphere that accompanies violent death in small communities, a mixture of horrified fascination and determined normalcy that Miss Marple had observed on several previous occasions. The village seemed to hold its breath while simultaneously buzzing with the particular energy that dramatic events invariably generated. Inspector Hartwell had established her headquarters in the committee room of the village hall, transforming the modest space into something resembling a metropolitan incident room. Miss Marple, delivering flowers for the Sunday service arrangement, observed through the open doorway the impressive array of photographs, diagrams, and evidence catalogues that covered every available surface. The inspector's methodology remained as systematic as ever. She'd identified two primary suspects through what she termed logical elimination of variables, and her investigation proceeded with the meticulous precision that had characterised her previous success. Mr. Gerald Pemberton, the deceased's estranged former husband, had arrived in St. Mary Mead the previous week under circumstances that struck Inspector Hartwell as highly suspicious. His presence coincided precisely with his former wife's social elevation, and several witnesses had observed heated exchanges between them regarding financial settlements that remained unresolved since their acrimonious divorce. Most illuminating, Inspector Hartwell explained to Constable Polk during one of their conferences. The timing is far too convenient to be coincidental. Former spouses rank among the most statistically probable perpetrators in poisoning cases. Miss Marple, who happened to be arranging the altar flowers within earshot of this discussion, reflected that statistical probability, whilst undoubtedly useful, sometimes failed to account for the peculiar complexities that governed human relationships. Her own acquaintance with divorced couples had suggested that whilst animosity certainly existed, it rarely manifested itself in such dramatically final terms. The second suspect occupied an equally prominent position in Inspector Hartwell's calculations. Mrs. Eleanor Fletcher, mother of the recently married Timothy, had maintained a friendship with Mrs. Pemberton that was characterised by the sort of competitive undertone that often develops between women of similar social aspirations but differing achievements. Inspector Hartwell's analysis of their relationship revealed a pattern of escalating rivalry that had reached particular intensity following Mrs. Pemberton's enhanced social status. The inspector had documented several instances of what she termed demonstrable jealousy between the two women, culminating in a rather public disagreement about precedence at the last church committee meeting. Poisoning represents the classical feminine approach to murder, the inspector observed to Dr. Haydock during one of their consultations. When one considers Mrs. Fletcher's access to the refreshment preparation and her obvious resentment of the victim's recent prominence, the psychological profile becomes quite compelling. Dr. Haydock's response carried the measured scepticism that his years of village practice had developed. Possible, certainly, Inspector, though I've found that understanding why people might commit murder often proves more complex than determining whether they could have done so. Miss Marple encountered a practical demonstration of Inspector Hartwell's investigative challenges when she observed the young woman's interview with Mr. Gerald Pemberton at the Blue Boar. The gentleman's responses, whilst evasive, provided no concrete evidence of murderous intent beyond the obvious animosity that divorce proceedings typically generated. Your financial disputes with Mrs. Pemberton were a matter of public record, the inspector stated with professional directness. Such circumstances provide clear motive for eliminating an obstacle to settlement. Mr. Pemberton's reply carried the weary resignation of someone who had endured considerable legal complexity. Inspector, if financial disagreement constituted grounds for murder, the divorce courts would require permanent medical attendance. Violet and I quarrelled about money, certainly, but I hardly required her death to resolve our difficulties. The inspector's subsequent interview with Mrs. Fletcher proved equally frustrating. The lady acknowledged her competitive feelings towards the deceased, but maintained that social rivalry scarcely justified homicidal action. Mrs. Pemberton could be rather trying in her attitudes, Mrs. Fletcher admitted with careful diplomacy. But surely, Inspector, you cannot seriously suggest that disagreements about church committee protocol might lead to murder? Miss Marple observed these proceedings with growing interest. Inspector Hartwell's scientific approach yielded abundant documentation, but seemed to struggle with the psychological motivations that might explain why individuals would resort to such extreme measures. The inspector appeared increasingly frustrated with the gap between logical suspicion and demonstrable proof. The forensic analysis of the poison itself provided tantalizingly insufficient guidance. Dr. Haydock's examination confirmed that Mrs. Pemberton had succumbed to a plant-based toxin that acted with remarkable swiftness, but the specific botanical source remained elusive despite extensive laboratory testing. Most unusual, Dr. Haydock confided to Miss Marple during their chance encounter at the chemist's shop. The symptoms suggest several possible agents, but none of the obvious candidates appear in sufficient concentration to explain the rapid onset. Inspector Hartwell's response to these analytical limitations was to intensify her systematic approach. She expanded her photographic documentation, conducted additional interviews with peripheral witnesses, and applied increasingly sophisticated scientific techniques to the available evidence. Yet despite this methodical thoroughness, the case appeared to resist resolution with stubborn persistence. Neither Mr. Pemberton nor Mrs. Fletcher could be definitively connected to the actual administration of poison, despite their apparent motives and undeniable opportunities. Miss Marple encountered Inspector Hartwell during one of the young woman's late evening visits to the crime scene, where she was conducting what appeared to be a re-examination of the physical evidence under different lighting conditions. "Good evening, Inspector. I trust your investigations are progressing satisfactorily." The inspector's response lacked her customary confidence. "The evidence remains inconclusive, Miss Marple. Despite thorough analysis, I cannot establish definitive proof connecting either suspect to the actual crime." Miss Marple observed the young woman's obvious frustration with sympathetic understanding. "How very trying for you, my dear. Though I have sometimes found that the most puzzling cases often reveal unexpected solutions when viewed from alternative perspectives." Inspector Hartwell's smile carried the strained courtesy of someone whose professional competence was encountering unexpected limitations. "Scientific investigation relies upon demonstrable evidence, Miss Marple. Alternative perspectives, however well-intentioned, cannot substitute for factual proof." As Miss Marple continued her evening walk, she reflected upon the curious spectacle of modern methodology confronting the enduring mysteries of human motivation. Inspector Hartwell's technical skills were undoubtedly impressive, yet something essential appeared to be missing from her systematic approach. Some understanding of the peculiar psychological currents that drove individuals to desperate measures. The case reminded Miss Marple rather forcibly of young Mr. Patterson's attempts to improve crop yields through purely scientific methods, quite overlooking the local knowledge that might have warned him about the particular drainage problems affecting that section of farmland. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's quiet investigation. The limitations of Inspector Hartwell's systematic approach had become increasingly apparent to Miss Marple during the week following Mrs. Pemberton's death. Whilst the young woman pursued her methodical analysis of physical evidence and obvious suspects, Miss Marple found herself drawn to those peripheral figures who possessed intimate knowledge of the household arrangements, yet remained largely invisible to official investigation. The morning found Miss Marple in earnest conversation with Mrs. Martha Simmons, who had served as Colonel Bantry's parlour-maid for the better part of 2 decades. Their discussion, conducted over tea in Mrs. Simmons's tidy kitchen, possessed the comfortable intimacy that develops between women who understand the essential importance of domestic detail. "Such a shocking business, Miss Marple," Mrs. Simmons confided, her voice carrying the particular gravity that servants reserve for matters affecting their employers' reputations. "Poor Mrs. Pemberton, and at such a lovely gathering. The Colonel has been quite beside himself with worry." Miss Marple accepted her second cup of tea with appreciative murmurs. "How very distressing for everyone concerned. I imagine the arrangements for such an elaborate party must have required considerable coordination amongst the staff." Mrs. Simmons's response revealed the professional pride that distinguished superior domestic service. "Indeed it did, Miss Marple. Everything planned to the minute, who would serve which tables, how the refreshments would be arranged, even which teacups would be used for the different courses." This last detail caught Miss Marple's attention with the suddenness of a bell striking the hour. "How very methodical! I confess myself curious about such arrangements. The precision required must be quite remarkable." The parlour-maid warmed to her subject with evident satisfaction. "Oh yes, Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry insists upon proper protocol for entertaining. The best china for the principal guests, of course, and specific serving patterns to ensure everything proceeds smoothly." Miss Marple's subsequent conversation with young Billy Hargreaves, who assisted with the garden maintenance at Gossington Hall, proved equally illuminating. The boy possessed that particular combination of observational acuity and social invisibility that often rendered servants the most reliable witnesses to significant events. "Saw you talking with Mrs. Simmons," Billy observed with the directness that characterized his generation. "Terrible thing about Mrs. Pemberton, wasn't it? Though I can't say I'm altogether surprised." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose with gentle inquiry. "Indeed? How very interesting, Billy. Whatever do you mean by that?" The young man's response carried the weight of knowledge accumulated through years of tending the Colonel's extensive gardens. "Well, you see, Miss Marple, Mrs. Pemberton had what you might call a particular difficulty with certain plants. Mentioned it to me last spring when she was admiring the borders. This revelation struck Miss Marple as potentially significant in ways that Inspector Hartwell's systematic investigation had not yet discovered. A difficulty, Billy? How very unfortunate for someone who enjoyed garden parties." "Severe allergy," she said. Something about her breathing becoming quite impossible if she came into contact with certain pollens. Made her carry one of those medical injection things in her handbag, just in case. Miss Marple's mind moved with the swift precision that significant discoveries demanded. An allergy severe enough to require emergency medication represented a vulnerability that few people beyond intimate friends and family would have known about. Yet here was a gardener's assistant who had been trusted with such personal information. Her afternoon visit to Mrs. Dolly Bantry provided additional pieces to the puzzle that was beginning to form in Miss Marple's consciousness. Their conversation, conducted over the needlework that both ladies found conducive to thoughtful discussion, revealed details that systematic police investigation might easily overlook. "Such a tragedy, Jane," Mrs. Bantry observed, her needle moving with the automatic precision of long practice. "Poor Violet was in such excellent spirits that afternoon. Particularly animated, I thought, almost excited about something." Miss Marple's own embroidery provided the perfect cover for careful questioning. How very sad that her last social occasion should have ended so tragically. I imagine the memorial service will be quite well attended. Mrs. Bantry's response carried the weight of genuine sorrow tinged with social concern. "Indeed it will, though I confess myself puzzled by one detail that the inspector seemed to dismiss rather quickly." "Indeed? Well, you see, Violet had specifically requested to be seated near the herb garden border. Said she wanted to discuss landscaping ideas with the Colonel. Rather unusual for her. Gardening was never among her particular interests." This detail resonated in Miss Marple's mind with the clarity of a tuning fork struck against crystal. Mrs. Pemberton's deliberate positioning near specific plantings, combined with her severe allergic condition, suggested possibilities that purely circumstantial evidence might not reveal. Her evening conversation with Dr. Haydock, encountered during her constitutional walk past the surgery, provided the final element that transformed scattered observations into coherent understanding. "Most puzzling case," the doctor confided, falling into step beside her with the easy companionship of old friendship. The symptoms were consistent with several possible toxins, but none of the obvious suspects appeared in sufficient concentration to explain the rapid onset. Miss Marple's response carried the gentle persistence that had served her well in previous investigations. "How very frustrating for you, Doctor, though I suppose such mysteries occasionally resolve themselves through unexpected channels." Dr. Haydock's professional experience had taught him to value Miss Marple's insights, despite their unconventional origins. "Indeed they do, Miss Marple, though I must say, this particular case has left me wondering whether we might be looking for something rather more subtle than conventional poisoning." "Subtlety often proves more effective than obvious methods," Miss Marple observed thoughtfully, "particularly when the perpetrator possesses intimate knowledge of the victim's particular vulnerabilities." As Miss Marple prepared for bed that evening, her mind moved with increasing clarity through the various elements of the case. Inspector Hartwell's systematic approach had identified the obvious suspects and documented the apparent circumstances, but had missed the crucial psychological element that explained both motive and method. The solution, Miss Marple realized, lay not in sophisticated toxicology or complex criminal planning, but in the simple exploitation of a known medical condition by someone who possessed both the knowledge and opportunity to create circumstances that would appear entirely accidental. The question that remained was whether Inspector Hartwell's confidence in scientific methodology would permit her to consider explanations that relied upon psychological insight rather than physical evidence. Chapter 9. The Second Victory. The resolution of Mrs. Pemberton's murder came with a swiftness that surprised even Miss Marple, though she had spent the better part of 3 sleepless nights arranging the various elements of her understanding into a coherent pattern. The Morning Post had brought a letter from her nephew Raymond's botanical friend, a gentleman whose expertise in rare plant allergies had proved most illuminating when consulted through carefully worded correspondence. Inspector Hartwell's summons to the village hall arrived with the crisp efficiency that characterized all her professional communications. Miss Marple found the young woman in a state of barely controlled frustration, surrounded by photographs and evidence charts that spoke eloquently of methodical investigation, yielding insufficient results. "Miss Marple, I wonder if you might spare a few moments to discuss this case," the inspector began, her tone carrying the reluctant acknowledgement of someone whose confidence had encountered unexpected obstacles. "Your local knowledge may provide insights that conventional investigation has overlooked." Miss Marple settled herself in the offered chair with the gentle precision that advancing years had made habitual, though her mind moved with considerably more agility than her measured movements might have suggested. "Of course, Inspector, though I confess myself uncertain how my observations might supplement your thorough analysis." The inspector's response revealed the particular kind of professional honesty that emerges when systematic methods encounter inexplicable complexities. "The physical evidence remains frustratingly inconclusive. Both primary suspects possessed motive and opportunity, yet neither can be definitively connected to the actual administration of poison." "How very trying," Miss Marple observed with genuine sympathy, "though I have sometimes found that the most puzzling cases resolve themselves when viewed from entirely unexpected perspectives." Inspector Hartwell's expression suggested the wary attention of someone whose professional certainties had been considerably shaken. "I should be grateful for any insights you might offer, Miss Marple. Your reputation for solving village mysteries is well established." Miss Marple accepted this grudging acknowledgement with characteristic grace, though she detected beneath the inspector's words a reluctant recognition that technical expertise might require supplementation from alternative approaches. "I wonder, Inspector, whether your investigation has considered the possibility that Mrs. Pemberton's death might not have resulted from conventional poisoning at all?" The inspector's eyebrows rose with sharp attention. Not conventional poisoning? But Dr. Haydock confirmed toxic symptoms consistent with plant-based agents. Miss Marple's needle moved with steady precision through her embroidery as she marshalled her thoughts with the care that complex explanations demanded. Indeed he did, though I have been wondering whether those symptoms might have resulted from what one might term assisted natural causes rather than deliberate toxin administration. The explanation that followed demonstrated the particular kind of logical progression that characterized Miss Marple's approach to human mysteries. Through careful questioning of household staff, she had discovered Mrs. Pemberton's severe allergy to a specific variety of flowering plant that grew in abundance along Colonel Bantry's herb garden border. The condition was quite serious, Miss Marple continued, noting Inspector Hartwell's growing attention, severe enough to require emergency medication, which Mrs. Pemberton carried religiously in her handbag. Yet young Billy mentioned that she had specifically requested seating near the very plants that posed such danger to her health. Inspector Hartwell's professional training asserted itself with renewed vigour. Are you suggesting that someone deliberately exposed her to allergens, knowing the potential consequences? Rather more subtle than that, my dear. I believe someone who knew of her condition arranged circumstances that would ensure fatal exposure whilst appearing entirely accidental. The inspector's scientific methodology had prepared her to analyse physical evidence and establish criminal timelines, but the psychological sophistication of Miss Marple's solution required considerable adjustment of perspective. The murder had been committed not through exotic poisons or complex criminal planning, but through the simple expedient of ensuring that Mrs. Pemberton's emergency medication remained inaccessible when desperately needed. Miss Marple's subsequent revelation of the perpetrator's identity emerged with the inexorable logic that characterises solutions to genuinely complex mysteries. The killer was neither Mr. Gerald Pemberton nor Mrs. Eleanor Fletcher, but someone whose intimate knowledge of the victim's medical condition had been gained through years of apparently devoted friendship. Mrs. Angela Whitfield, Miss Marple announced with quiet certainty. She had nursed Mrs. Pemberton through several previous allergic episodes and knew precisely how to create circumstances that would prove fatal whilst appearing entirely natural. Inspector Hartwell's response revealed the particular satisfaction that accompanies the resolution of professional challenges through unexpected methods. But what was her motive? Mrs. Whitfield appeared genuinely devoted to Mrs. Pemberton. Miss Marple's explanation drew upon the deep understanding of human nature that village life had provided over many decades. Mrs. Whitfield's devotion had gradually transformed into resentment as Mrs. Pemberton's social prominence overshadowed her own more modest circumstances. The final catalyst had been Mrs. Pemberton's casual announcement of her intention to leave a substantial bequest to London charities rather than local friends. Jealousy of the most corrosive kind, Miss Marple observed sadly, the sort that festers beneath apparent affection until it destroys both friendship and conscience. The confrontation with Mrs. Whitfield, conducted in Inspector Hartwell's presence, proceeded with the inevitable progression that characterises the exposure of long-concealed guilt. Faced with Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable reconstruction of events, the woman's composure crumbled with remarkable swiftness. She was going to leave everything to those London institutions, Mrs. Whitfield sobbed, her carefully maintained facade dissolving entirely. After all our years of friendship, all my devoted care during her difficulties, I knew about her condition, knew exactly how to ensure that her medication would be mislaid when the attack came. Inspector Hartwell observed this confession with emotions that her professional training had not entirely prepared her to accommodate. The technical aspects of the crime had been remarkably simple. A strategically placed bouquet of the offending flowers, combined with the temporary removal of Mrs. Pemberton's emergency medication during the social confusion of a garden party. Yet the psychological sophistication required to conceive and execute such a plan demonstrated complexities that purely scientific investigation might easily overlook. The solution had emerged not through forensic analysis or systematic elimination of suspects, but through careful attention to human relationships and emotional motivations. As Mrs. Whitfield was led away in Constable Polk's custody, Inspector Hartwell found herself experiencing the particular humility that accompanies unexpected education in professional limitations. "Miss Marple," she began with obvious difficulty, "I owe you a considerable apology. Your methods, your understanding of human nature, revealed elements that my scientific approach had entirely missed." Miss Marple's response carried the gentle wisdom that had guided her through many similar revelations of human frailty. My dear Inspector, each approach has its proper place. Your systematic methodology provided essential foundation, whilst local knowledge supplied the psychological insights necessary for complete understanding.
Okay.
The Inspector's acknowledgement of Miss Marple's contribution marked a significant moment in her professional development. The recognition that technical expertise, however impressive, required supplementation from alternative forms of understanding when confronting the enduring mysteries of human motivation. Chapter 10. Mutual Respect. The afternoon following Mrs. Whitfield's confession brought with it that peculiar quality of emotional exhaustion that accompanies the resolution of mysteries involving long-standing friendships and concealed betrayals. Miss Marple, tending her garden with the methodical precision that had always provided comfort during periods of moral complexity, reflected that human nature possessed depths of duplicity that even extensive village experience could find surprising. The gentle knock upon her cottage door arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, accompanied by the distinctive sound of Inspector Hartwell's measured footsteps upon the garden path. Miss Marple observed through her sitting-room window that the young woman's bearing had undergone a subtle but unmistakable transformation since the previous day's revelations. The confident stride remained, but tempered now with a quality of thoughtful reflection that had been notably absent during her earlier investigations. Inspector Hartwell, Miss Marple greeted her visitor with the warm courtesy that genuine respect deserved. "How very kind of you to call. I trust the formalities regarding Mrs. Whitfield's confession are proceeding satisfactorily." The inspector's acceptance of the offered chair carried the careful deliberation of someone whose professional certainties had undergone considerable adjustment. Her customary brisk efficiency remained evident, but softened now by what appeared to be genuine humility regarding the limitations of purely technical approaches to human mysteries. "Miss Marple, I find myself in the rather uncomfortable position of owing you both an apology and my gratitude," Inspector Hartwell began, her tone reflecting the particular difficulty that accomplished professionals experience when acknowledging their own fallibility. "My behaviour since arriving in St. Mary Mead has been presumptuous in ways that I now recognise were both ungracious and professionally short-sighted." Miss Marple's response carried the gentle wisdom that had guided her through many similar moments of human reconciliation. "My dear Inspector, you have nothing whatever for which to apologise. Your systematic methodology provided essential foundation for understanding the circumstances of Mrs. Pemberton's death. Without your thorough documentation and professional expertise, my own observations might have remained mere speculation." The conversation that followed revealed the particular quality of mutual recognition that emerges when two intelligent individuals discover the complementary nature of their respective approaches to complex problems. Inspector Hartwell's acknowledgement of her professional limitations demonstrated the kind of intellectual honesty that Miss Marple had always found admirable in younger persons. "I was so confident in the superiority of scientific detection," the inspector continued with obvious difficulty, "that I dismissed the importance of understanding human psychology and personal relationships. Your solution demonstrated complexities that my training had simply not prepared me to recognise." Miss Marple's needle moved with steady precision through her embroidery as she considered her response with characteristic care. "I have found, my dear, that most mysteries possess both technical and psychological elements that require different forms of understanding. Your systematic analysis revealed the circumstances under which the crime occurred, whilst village knowledge provided insights into why someone might commit such a terrible act. The inspector's professional training had taught her to value objective analysis above subjective interpretation, yet Mrs. Whitfield's sophisticated manipulation of circumstances had required precisely the kind of psychological insight that Miss Marple's years of village observation had developed. The murder had succeeded not through technical complexity, but through intimate understanding of human vulnerability. "Your approach to investigation," Inspector Hartwell observed with growing appreciation, "encompasses elements that police training tends to overlook. The importance of understanding why people behave as they do rather than simply documenting what they have done." Miss Marple's smile carried the particular warmth reserved for moments of genuine understanding between individuals of different generations. Each approach has its proper place, Inspector. Your scientific methodology ensures that important physical evidence is not overlooked, whilst attention to human nature helps explain the motivations that drive people to desperate measures. The afternoon progressed with the comfortable rhythm that characterises conversations between individuals who have discovered mutual respect despite their apparent differences. Inspector Hartwell's questions revealed genuine curiosity about Miss Marple's methods, whilst her own explanations of forensic techniques demonstrated the impressive precision that modern detection could achieve. I confess myself curious about your ability to observe such subtle psychological details, the inspector remarked during a pause in their discussion. The way you noticed Mrs. Whitfield's particular reactions, the significance of seemingly innocent conversations, such insights appear to require remarkable sensitivity to human nature. Miss Marple's response drew upon the accumulated wisdom of many decades spent observing the endless variations of human behaviour within the microcosm of village life. One learns, over time, to recognise the patterns that govern how people respond to stress, jealousy, and moral conflict. Villages provide excellent opportunities for such observation, since the same fundamental emotions appear repeatedly in different circumstances. Inspector Hartwell's growing appreciation for Miss Marple's methods reflected a professional maturity that spoke well of her character. The young woman possessed sufficient intellectual honesty to recognise when her own training proved inadequate, and sufficient wisdom to value alternative approaches rather than dismissing them as unscientific. "I wonder," the inspector ventured with obvious hesitation, "whether you might consider sharing your insights during future investigations. Your understanding of human psychology could prove invaluable in cases where technical analysis alone proves insufficient." Miss Marple's consideration of this suggestion reflected her own recognition that modern detection methods possessed capabilities that traditional village observation could not match. The combination of systematic forensic analysis with careful attention to human motivation might indeed prove more effective than either approach employed individually. "How very interesting, Inspector. I confess myself intrigued by the possibility of observing your scientific methods more closely. Perhaps we might discover that apparent contradictions between old and new approaches are actually complementary strengths." The inspector's obvious relief at this response demonstrated her genuine desire for collaboration, rather than competition between their respective methods. Her professional confidence had been sobered but not destroyed by recent events, whilst her appreciation for alternative approaches had been considerably enhanced. As the afternoon drew towards its natural conclusion, both women recognised that their conversation had established something more significant than mere professional cooperation. They had discovered the foundation for a partnership that might combine the best elements of traditional wisdom and modern technique in service of truth and justice. Inspector Hartwell's departure carried with it the promise of future collaboration, whilst Miss Marple reflected that village life continued to provide unexpected opportunities for learning and growth, regardless of one's age or accumulated experience. Chapter 11. The third mystery begins. The discovery of the Reverend Clement's untimely demise came with the particular shock that accompanies unexpected tragedy in quiet communities. Miss Marple, preparing her customary breakfast of toast and marmalade, became aware of the disturbance through the sound of hurried footsteps upon the high street, and the distinctive note of urgency that characterises voices carrying grave news. Young Mrs. Fletcher, still adjusting to married life after her recent wedding ceremony, appeared at Miss Marple's cottage gate with the breathless agitation of someone who had been designated the bearer of terrible tidings. Her face bore that expression of mingled horror and excitement that village residents invariably displayed when dramatic events disrupted their ordinary routines. "Oh, Miss Marple," she gasped, clutching the garden gate with hands that trembled visibly. "The most dreadful thing has happened. The Reverend Clement has been found dead in his study, and Inspector Hartwell says the circumstances are most peculiar indeed." Miss Marple received this intelligence with the calm attention that experience had taught her to apply to unexpected developments. She had observed, over many years, that sudden deaths in small communities rarely proved as straightforward as initial appearances might suggest, particularly when those deaths involved individuals whose positions exposed them to the complex undercurrents of village life. "How very distressing," Miss Marple murmured, setting aside her breakfast with the careful precision that advancing years had made habitual. "I trust, Doctor, Haydock has been summoned to examine the poor gentleman." Mrs. Fletcher's response revealed the particular confusion that accompanies discoveries which challenge conventional understanding. "Well, that's precisely what makes it so puzzling, Miss Marple. Dr. Haydock says it appears to be natural death, heart failure, he believes, but the circumstances are so very strange that Inspector Hartwell has been called to investigate." The details that emerged during Miss Marple's subsequent walk to the vicarage painted a picture of mystery that possessed all the elements of a particularly challenging puzzle. The Reverend Clement had been discovered by his housekeeper, Mrs. Mills, when she arrived to prepare his morning tea. He was seated at his desk in the study, apparently having worked late into the evening on what appeared to be Sunday's sermon. The study door had been locked from the inside, with the key still in place on the interior side. The windows, whilst open to admit the evening air, were secured with latches that could only be operated from within the room. The chimney, though adequate for ventilation, was far too narrow to permit human passage. In every respect, the study appeared to represent a perfect example of what detective fiction termed a locked room mystery. Inspector Hartwell's presence at the vicarage demonstrated the enhanced analytical approach that had characterized her recent investigations. Miss Marple observed that the young woman's methodology now incorporated elements of psychological observation alongside her customary technical precision, a development that spoke well of her professional adaptability. "Miss Marple," the inspector greeted her with the courteous recognition that their recent collaboration had established. "I should be grateful for your observations regarding this puzzling situation. The physical circumstances suggest natural death, yet certain elements appear inconsistent with that conclusion." Miss Marple accepted this invitation with the gentle interest that complex mysteries invariably aroused in her analytical mind. Her examination of the study revealed a scene that possessed all the orderly tranquillity one might expect from a clergyman's scholarly retreat, yet something in the arrangement struck her as subtly discordant. The Reverend Clement sat slumped forward across his desk, his hand still grasping the pen with which he had been writing. His sermon notes, scattered across the leather surface, bore witness to his theological labours, whilst his expression suggested the peaceful release that often accompanies sudden cardiac events. Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination had confirmed the apparent cause of death. "Heart failure, certainly," he confided to Miss Marple during a quiet moment away from the official proceedings. "Though I must confess, Jane, that something about the circumstances troubles my professional instincts." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose with gentle inquiry. "Indeed, Doctor? How very interesting. Might one ask what particular aspect causes you concern?" Dr. Haydock's response carried the weight of medical experience accumulated over many years of village practice. The poor fellow's expression primarily. Heart failure typically produces signs of distress. Pain, difficulty breathing, obvious suffering. Yet Clement appears almost startled, as if something had shocked him, rather than caused physical discomfort. This observation resonated in Miss Marple's consciousness with the clarity of a well-struck note. She had witnessed sufficient natural deaths to recognise the particular expressions that accompanied different forms of final illness, and Dr. Haydock's assessment suggested complexities that purely medical examination might not reveal. Inspector Hartwell's systematic investigation of the locked study proceeded with the methodical precision that had characterised her previous cases, enhanced now by attention to psychological details that might illuminate the circumstances of the vicar's demise. Her measurements of the room's dimensions, photographic documentation of the scene, and careful examination of potential entry points demonstrated professional thoroughness of the highest order. Yet the physical evidence remained stubbornly consistent with natural death occurring in circumstances of complete isolation. The locked door, secured windows, and narrow chimney presented an apparently impregnable barrier to external interference, whilst the vicar's position and apparent cause of death suggested nothing more sinister than cardiac failure during late evening scholarly work. Miss Marple's own observations focused upon elements that technical analysis might overlook, the subtle disarray of papers that suggested sudden interruption rather than gradual fatigue, the particular way the vicar's spectacles had fallen, the curious positioning of his theological volumes that implied hasty consultation rather than methodical study. "Most puzzling," she murmured to Inspector Hartwell during a pause in the official examination. "One would expect a gentleman suffering heart failure whilst writing to show signs of gradual distress, perhaps attempts to summon assistance, or evidence of struggling with his condition. Yet everything suggests sudden, unexpected incapacitation." Inspector Hartwell's response demonstrated the collaborative approach that their recent partnership had established. "Precisely my own observation, Miss Marple. The scene appears consistent with shock or extreme surprise rather than progressive cardiac symptoms. The afternoon brought additional complications that transformed an already puzzling situation into something approaching a genuine mystery. Inspector Slack's arrival from the county headquarters, summoned by telephone to assist with what local authorities considered an unusually complex case, introduced official recognition that the Reverend Clement's death required investigation beyond routine medical examination. Inspector Slack's consultation with both Inspector Hartwell and Miss Marple reflected the enhanced respect that her recent successes had earned within professional circles. "Most irregular circumstances," he observed, surveying the locked study with obvious perplexity. "If this is murder, it represents a technique that challenges conventional understanding." As evening approached and the initial examination concluded, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the peculiar elements that distinguished this case from previous mysteries she had encountered. The perfect isolation of the crime scene, combined with the apparent impossibility of external interference, suggested either natural death under unusual circumstances or criminal methodology of remarkable sophistication. The Reverend Clement's position in the community had exposed him to the full range of human nature that village life encompassed, from genuine spiritual seeking to the petty jealousies and moral compromises that even religious communities could not entirely escape. His death in such mysterious circumstances promised to reveal aspects of St. Mary Mead's social fabric that routine investigation might never uncover. Chapter 12. Joining forces, the formal establishment of their investigative partnership, occurred with the understated ceremony that characterizes significant developments in English village life. Miss Marple, arriving at the vicarage on the morning following the discovery, found Inspector Hartwell in earnest consultation with Inspector Slack regarding the allocation of responsibilities for what had officially become a joint investigation. The scene possessed that peculiar quality of organized efficiency that emerges when professional competence encounters genuine puzzlement. Inspector Slack, whose previous encounters with Miss Marple had taught him to respect her analytical capabilities, despite their unconventional origins, greeted her with a courteous deference that experience had shown to be both prudent and appropriate. "Miss Marple," he acknowledged with obvious relief, "Inspector Hartwell has suggested that your local knowledge and observational skills might prove invaluable in this most perplexing case. I confess myself hopeful that your combined expertise will illuminate circumstances that have thus far defied conventional analysis." Miss Marple accepted this invitation with the gentle precision that had characterized her approach to previous mysteries. Her recent collaboration with Inspector Hartwell had demonstrated the complementary nature of their respective methods, whilst the complexity of the present case clearly required both systematic forensic analysis and careful attention to human psychology. "How very kind, Inspector Slack. I should be delighted to assist in whatever modest capacity my observations might prove useful. though I suspect this particular mystery will require the full application of both scientific methodology and local understanding. Inspector Hartwell's response to this arrangement revealed the professional maturity that her recent experiences had fostered. The young woman's initial confidence in purely technical approaches had been tempered by recognition that human mysteries often possessed complexities that systematic analysis alone could not unravel. I believe our previous collaboration demonstrated the effectiveness of combining different investigative approaches, she observed with characteristic directness. This case appears to require both technical expertise and psychological insight if we are to understand how such an apparently impossible crime could have been committed. The division of responsibilities that emerged reflected a sophisticated understanding of their respective strengths. Inspector Hartwell would apply her forensic skills to the physical impossibilities presented by the locked study, whilst Miss Marple would investigate the human elements that might explain why someone would desire the Reverend Clement's death, and how they might have achieved it. Their first joint examination of the crime scene proceeded with the careful coordination that effective partnerships require. Inspector Hartwell's systematic documentation of every physical detail provided the foundation upon which Miss Marple's more intuitive observations could build, whilst her own insights into human behaviour suggested directions for technical analysis that might otherwise have been overlooked. The study itself remained as mystifying as ever. The door, secured from within by a substantial lock whose key remained in place on the interior side, presented an apparently insurmountable barrier to external interference. The windows, whilst open to admit the evening air, were fastened with catches that could only be operated from inside the room. The chimney, examined with considerable thoroughness by Inspector Hartwell's technical equipment, proved far too narrow to permit human passage. "Most extraordinary," Inspector Hartwell murmured, consulting her precise measurements of the room's dimensions. "Every conventional means of entry or exit appears to have been impossible, yet the alternative explanation, natural death, seems inconsistent with the evidence of the scene itself." Miss Marple's own observations focused upon the subtle details that might reveal the psychological state of the room's occupant during his final moments. The particular disarray of the sermon notes suggested sudden interruption rather than gradual fatigue, whilst the positioning of theological volumes implied hasty consultation of specific passages rather than leisurely scholarly contemplation. "Most interesting," she observed to Inspector Hartwell during their careful examination. "One might expect a gentleman working peacefully on his Sunday sermon to display rather different patterns of behaviour, more methodical arrangement of materials perhaps, and less evidence of urgent searching through reference works." Their collaborative approach extended to the systematic interviewing of potential witnesses, with Inspector Hartwell's technical questioning complemented by Miss Marple's gentle inquiries into the personal relationships and emotional undercurrents that might provide motive for such a crime. Mrs. Mills, the vicar's housekeeper, proved particularly illuminating under this combined approach. Inspector Hartwell's systematic timeline established the precise circumstances of the discovery, whilst Miss Marple's careful attention to emotional nuances revealed underlying tensions that routine questioning might have missed. "Such a devoted gentleman," Mrs. Mills confided during Miss Marple's gentle inquiries, "though I must say he had seemed rather troubled these past weeks, not his usual cheerful self at all, more preoccupied, as if something was weighing heavily upon his mind." This observation resonated with particular significance when considered alongside Inspector Hartwell's technical findings. The physical evidence suggested sudden shock or surprise rather than gradual cardiac failure, whilst the housekeeper's testimony indicated underlying stress that might have contributed to the vicar's vulnerability. Their investigation of the vicar's recent activities revealed additional complexities that neither detective might have discovered working independently. Inspector Hartwell's systematic examination of his correspondence and financial records provided factual framework, whilst Miss Marple's understanding of village relationships explained the personal significance of various social interactions. "Most curious," Inspector Hartwell observed during their afternoon consultation in the study, The Reverend's papers suggest considerable anxiety about some matter of church business, yet the specific nature of his concerns remains unclear from the documentation alone. Miss Marple's response drew upon the accumulated wisdom of many years spent observing the intricate social dynamics that governed village life. Perhaps, my dear Inspector, the answer lies not in what is written down, but in what people felt unable to commit to paper. Villages possessed their own methods of communication that often bypass official documentation entirely. The partnership that had emerged between them reflected a sophisticated understanding of how different analytical approaches could enhance, rather than compete with each other. Inspector Hartwell's scientific methodology provided a central factual foundation, whilst Miss Marple's psychological insights suggested directions for investigation that technical analysis alone might never have revealed. As the afternoon progressed, both women recognized that they had established something more significant than mere professional cooperation. Their collaboration represented a new model of detection that combined the precision of modern forensic science with the wisdom of traditional observation, creating possibilities for understanding human mysteries that neither approach could achieve independently. The locked room puzzle that confronted them would require every aspect of their combined expertise, challenging both scientific analysis and psychological insight in ways that promised to test the full potential of their partnership. Chapter 13. The Locked Room Puzzle. The systematic examination of the vicarage study's architectural peculiarities commenced with the dawn of the second day, when Inspector Hartwell arrived bearing an impressive array of technical equipment that spoke eloquently of Scotland Yard's resources when properly motivated. Miss Marple, observing these preparations from her position beside the ancient oak desk, reflected that modern detection possessed capabilities that would have seemed quite miraculous to previous generations of investigators. Inspector Hartwell's methodology had evolved considerably since her arrival in St Mary Mead. The young woman now approached each measurement and calculation with a precision tempered by awareness that physical evidence, however meticulously gathered, required interpretation through understanding of human psychology and local circumstances. "The dimensions of this room present a most intriguing puzzle," she observed, consulting her detailed measurements whilst Miss Marple watched with genuine admiration for such methodical thoroughness. "Every conventional means of entry appears physically impossible, yet we are confronted with circumstances that strongly suggest external interference." Miss Marple's contribution to this technical analysis drew upon knowledge accumulated through decades of village observation. Her familiarity with the vicarage's history and architectural development provided context that Inspector Hartwell's scientific instruments could not reveal, whilst her understanding of local customs suggested possibilities that purely technical analysis might overlook. "I wonder, my dear Inspector, whether we might benefit from examining the building's original construction plans," Miss Marple suggested with the gentle diffidence that characterised her most penetrating insights. The vicarage underwent considerable renovation during the 1880s, when Bishop Marlowe insisted upon modernising the clerical residences. Such alterations often created architectural curiosities that contemporary residents might not fully appreciate. This observation proved remarkably prescient. Inspector Hartwell's subsequent investigation of the diocesan archives, guided by Miss Marple's knowledge of ecclesiastical bureaucracy, revealed structural modifications that had significantly altered the study's original design. The room had once possessed a second window, subsequently bricked up during Victorian improvements, whilst the chimney had been narrowed to improve heating efficiency. "Most illuminating," Inspector Hartwell declared, spreading the architectural drawings across the vicar's desk with careful precision. These modifications created structural anomalies that might not be apparent to casual observation. Miss Marple's examination of these historical documents revealed details that technical analysis alone might have missed. Her understanding of Victorian domestic arrangements suggested that certain architectural features might serve purposes beyond their obvious functions, whilst her knowledge of local building traditions identified elements that contemporary observation could easily overlook. The breakthrough in their understanding came through the combination of Inspector Hartwell's precise measurements and Miss Marple's intuitive grasp of architectural possibilities. The chimney, whilst indeed too narrow for human passage in its present configuration, retained elements of its original construction that suggested alternative uses. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, studying the architectural drawings with a careful attention that significant discoveries demanded. During the original construction, this chimney served multiple fireplaces throughout the building. The Victorian modifications narrowed the main flue but left subsidiary passages that might not be immediately apparent. Inspector Hartwell's technical examination of these architectural curiosities proceeded with systematic thoroughness enhanced by psychological insight. Her measurements revealed that whilst the main chimney remained impractically narrow, a secondary flue, designed to serve the study's original fireplace, had been concealed rather than entirely eliminated during the 19th century renovations. "Extraordinary," the inspector declared, her scientific training asserting itself with renewed vigour. This concealed passage would permit access to the study from above, though it would require considerable knowledge of the building's structural peculiarities. Miss Marple's response drew upon the particular understanding of human nature that village life had provided. The exploitation of such architectural knowledge suggested intimate familiarity with the vicarage's history, the kind of detailed understanding that developed through long association rather than casual observation. "Most significant, I believe," she observed thoughtfully. "Such knowledge would be possessed by very few individuals, perhaps someone involved in the original renovations, or their descendants, or possibly someone whose duties required detailed familiarity with the building's maintenance requirements." Their investigation of potential suspects proceeded with the collaborative efficiency that their partnership had developed. Inspector Hartwell's systematic analysis of who possessed both motive and means combined with Miss Marple's understanding of village relationships to create a comprehensive picture of possible perpetrators. The architectural solution to the locked room mystery represented only the first stage of their investigation. Understanding how the crime might have been committed required additional insight into why someone would have desired the Reverend Clement's death and possessed sufficient knowledge to exploit the vicarage's structural peculiarities. Inspector Hartwell's technical expertise proved invaluable in determining the precise method by which the concealed passage might have been utilised. Her examination of the chimney's interior revealed traces of recent disturbance, minute evidence that sophisticated forensic analysis could detect, but that casual inspection would certainly have missed. "Most telling," she declared, displaying photographic evidence of the subtle indicators that confirmed their theoretical reconstruction. Someone with considerable agility and detailed architectural knowledge accessed this study through means that would appear impossible to conventional observation. Miss Marple's contribution to understanding the psychological aspects of the crime drew upon her extensive experience with human motivation under stress. The killer had demonstrated remarkable sang-froid in exploiting such an unusual method, suggesting either desperate circumstances or the particular ruthlessness that emerges when individuals believe themselves beyond conventional detection. "The employment of such sophisticated means," she observed with characteristic insight, "suggests someone who felt confident that routine investigation would accept the appearance of natural death. Only discovery of the architectural possibilities would reveal the true nature of the crime." Their combined investigation had revealed not merely the technical solution to an apparently impossible puzzle, but the psychological sophistication required to conceive and execute such a plan. The locked room mystery had been solved through the application of both scientific methodology and intuitive understanding, a demonstration of how their complementary approaches could achieve results that neither might have accomplished independently. Yet the identification of method represented only the beginning of their investigation. Understanding who possessed both the necessary knowledge and sufficient motivation to commit such an ingenious crime would require the full application of their combined analytical capabilities, enhanced by careful attention to the complex human relationships that governed village life beneath its tranquil surface. Chapter 14. Village Secrets Emerge. The revelation of the Reverend Clement's private difficulties emerged with the gradual inevitability that characterises the uncovering of long-concealed village secrets. Miss Marple, whose morning constitutional had provided her with unparalleled opportunities for observing the subtle currents of community life, had noted certain disquieting elements in the vicar's recent behaviour that spoke of burdens heavier than ordinary pastoral concerns. Inspector Hartwell's systematic examination of the vicar's personal papers had yielded evidence of financial irregularities that painted a distinctly troubling picture of his final months. The methodical analysis that she brought to such documentary research, enhanced now by appreciation for the psychological implications of her discoveries, revealed a pattern of mounting desperation that conventional clerical duties could scarcely have generated. Most disturbing, the inspector observed during their morning consultation in the study, her precise handwriting recording details that spoke eloquently of moral compromise. The Reverend appears to have been involved in certain financial transactions that would have constituted serious breaches of ecclesiastical responsibility. Miss Marple received these revelations with the thoughtful attention that experience had taught her to apply to evidence of human frailty. Her years of village observation had demonstrated repeatedly that even the most exemplary individuals possessed capacities for moral failure when subjected to sufficient pressure, whilst the particular vulnerabilities of those in positions of trust often created circumstances that tested character beyond its natural limits. "How very sad," she murmured, examining the documentary evidence with careful precision. "Though I confess myself not entirely surprised, Inspector." Poor Mr. Clement had seemed increasingly troubled these past weeks, the sort of preoccupation that suggests burdens too heavy for comfortable bearing. The specific nature of the vicar's difficulties became apparent through Inspector Hartwell's meticulous reconstruction of his financial activities. Church funds had been systematically diverted through a complex series of transactions that demonstrated considerable sophistication in concealing irregular practices, whilst his personal gambling debts had accumulated to levels that would have been impossible to satisfy through legitimate clerical income. Miss Marple's contribution to understanding these revelations drew upon her extensive knowledge of village relationships and the particular pressures that small communities could generate. Her gentle inquiries among the parishioners revealed undercurrents of suspicion and resentment that official investigation might easily have overlooked. "I had wondered about certain aspects of the church accounts," confided Mrs. Price Ridley, during one of Miss Marple's tactful conversations. "As treasurer of the Ladies' Guild, one does notice when familiar patterns of expenditure begin to show unusual variations. This observation proved remarkably significant when considered alongside Inspector Hartwell's documentary analysis. The combination of technical examination and intuitive understanding revealed that the Reverend Clement's financial irregularities had not escaped notice among those parishioners whose duties brought them into contact with church finances. Their investigation of the vicar's gambling activities proceeded with similar collaborative efficiency. Inspector Hartwell's systematic approach to tracing financial transactions complemented Miss Marple's understanding of how such difficulties might manifest themselves in village life, creating a comprehensive picture of mounting desperation and increasing recklessness. "The pattern suggests escalating involvement with individuals of questionable reputation," Inspector Hartwell observed, consulting her careful analysis of the vicar's correspondence. "His debts appear to have reached levels that would have required immediate resolution through extraordinary means." Miss Marple's understanding of human psychology under extreme stress provided essential context for these financial revelations. Her experience with individuals facing moral crisis had demonstrated that desperation could drive even fundamentally decent people to actions that ordinary circumstances would render unthinkable. The discovery of actual blackmail evidence came through Miss Marple's particular talent for encouraging confidences from those whom official investigation might intimidate. Her conversation with young Tommy Pierce, whose duties as general errand boy provided him with unusual opportunities for observation, revealed knowledge that systematic questioning had not elicited. "Saw the vicar meeting with that London gentleman again last Tuesday," Tommy confided with the directness characteristic of his age. "Seemed rather heated, their conversation, not at all friendly like you'd expect with church business." This intelligence, when combined with Inspector Hartwell's technical analysis of the vicar's recent correspondence, revealed evidence of systematic extortion that explained both his financial difficulties and his increasing desperation. The blackmailer had exploited knowledge of the vicar's gambling debts to extract church funds through threats of exposure that would have destroyed both his clerical career and his position in the community. Most illuminating, Inspector Hartwell declared, examining the coded references in the vicar's private papers that confirmed their theoretical reconstruction. The Reverend was trapped in a cycle of financial obligation that offered no honourable means of escape. Miss Marple's response drew upon the accumulated wisdom of many years spent observing how moral pressure could corrupt even exemplary individuals. The vicar's situation had created vulnerabilities that unscrupulous persons could exploit, whilst his position of trust had provided access to funds that desperate circumstances made increasingly tempting. The broader implications of these discoveries extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the vicar's death. His involvement in financial irregularities and susceptibility to blackmail had created a network of secrets and resentments that touched numerous aspects of village life, providing multiple motives for those who might have desired his permanent silence. Inspector Hartwell's systematic identification of individuals who possessed knowledge of the vicar's difficulties revealed a surprisingly extensive list of potential suspects. The combination of her technical analysis and Miss Marple's understanding of village relationships created a comprehensive picture of how private scandals could generate public consequences through the complex web of community connections. The question, Miss Marple observed thoughtfully, becomes not merely who might have desired the Reverend's death, but who possessed both the necessary knowledge of his vulnerabilities and the architectural expertise required to exploit the vicarage's structural peculiarities. Their investigation had revealed the existence of secrets that transformed the apparent mystery of natural death into a complex puzzle involving financial crime, personal blackmail, and community betrayal. The solution would require not merely technical analysis of physical evidence, but penetrating understanding of how human weakness could create circumstances that desperate individuals might exploit through violence. Chapter 15. The partnership deepens. The evolution of their investigative partnership had acquired a natural rhythm that reflected the complementary nature of their respective analytical approaches. Miss Marple, observing Inspector Hartwell's growing appreciation for the subtle human elements that governed village mysteries, reflected with quiet satisfaction that wisdom possessed the peculiar capacity to manifest itself through unexpected channels when circumstances demanded such development. The morning found them engaged in what had become their customary consultation at Miss Marple's cottage, where the comfortable domesticity of the sitting room provided an atmosphere conducive to the sort of reflective analysis that complex cases required. Inspector Hartwell had taken to visiting each morning before commencing her official duties, finding that Miss Marple's gentle observations often illuminated aspects of their investigation that systematic methodology alone might overlook. "I confess myself increasingly impressed by the value of local knowledge in criminal investigation," the inspector observed, accepting her second cup of tea with the genuine appreciation that marked her growing comfort with village customs. "Your insights into community relationships have revealed motivations and connections that purely technical analysis would certainly have missed." Miss Marple's response carried the modest satisfaction of someone whose methods had achieved recognition without compromising their essential character. Her years of village observation had taught her that human nature possessed consistencies that transcended social circumstances, whilst the particular intimacies of small community life provided unparalleled opportunities for understanding how individual psychology manifested itself under various pressures. "How very kind of you to say so, my dear Inspector. Though I have found our collaboration equally illuminating, your systematic approach ensures that important physical evidence receives proper attention, whilst your professional training provides frameworks for understanding criminal behaviour that my amateur observations might easily miss." Their discussion of the vicar's case proceeded with the careful coordination that effective partnerships require. Inspector Hartwell's technical analysis of the evidence had established the circumstances under which the crime could have been committed, whilst Miss Marple's understanding of village relationships suggested directions for investigation that scientific methodology alone might never have revealed. The breakthrough in their understanding came through what Miss Marple had come to recognise as the inspector's particular talent for synthesising complex information into coherent patterns. The young woman's systematic mind, enhanced now by appreciation for psychological subtleties, had begun to perceive connections between apparently disparate elements of the case. The architectural knowledge required to exploit the concealed chimney passage, Inspector Hartwell observed, consulting her careful notes with characteristic precision, combined with intimate awareness of the vicar's financial difficulties, suggests someone whose position provided access to both structural information and private knowledge. Miss Marple's needle moved with steady rhythm through her embroidery as she considered the implications of this observation. Her understanding of village social dynamics suggested that such comprehensive knowledge would be possessed by very few individuals, those whose duties or relationships had provided opportunities for both architectural familiarity and personal confidence. Most perceptive, Inspector, I've been reflecting upon your analysis, and it occurs to me that we might benefit from considering not merely who possessed such knowledge, but how they might have acquired it without arousing suspicion. Their investigation of individuals who combined architectural expertise with personal knowledge of the vicar's difficulties revealed a surprisingly limited group of potential suspects. Inspector Hartwell's systematic approach to eliminating impossible candidates complemented Miss Marple's intuitive understanding of character assessment, creating a methodology that proved remarkably effective. The discovery of Mr. Geoffrey Whitmore's involvement came through Miss Marple's particular talent for encouraging confidences from those whom official questioning might intimidate. Her conversation with Mrs. Dalrymple, whose late husband had supervised the Victorian renovations to the vicarage, revealed knowledge that formal investigation had not uncovered. Dear Geoffrey was so fascinated by those old architectural drawings, Mrs. Dalrymple confided during their afternoon tea. Spent hours studying them when he was helping with the Church Restoration Committee, said the Victorian builders had created quite ingenious solutions to various structural problems. This intelligence, when combined with Inspector Hartwell's analysis of who possessed intimate knowledge of the vicar's financial irregularities, provided the foundation for a theoretical reconstruction that explained both motive and means. Mr. Whitmore's position as churchwarden had given him access to financial records that revealed the extent of clerical misconduct, whilst his involvement in restoration work had provided detailed familiarity with the vicarage's architectural peculiarities. Inspector Hartwell's subsequent investigation of Mr. Whitmore's recent activities proceeded with the systematic thoroughness that had characterized her previous successes, enhanced now by sensitivity to psychological elements that might illuminate his motivations. Her analysis revealed patterns of behavior that suggested increasing desperation regarding his own financial circumstances. Most significant, she declared, examining documentary evidence that confirmed their theoretical suspicions. Whitmore's own speculative investments had failed catastrophically, leaving him in circumstances that would have made the vicar's embezzled funds extremely tempting. Miss Marple's understanding of how moral pressure could corrupt fundamentally decent individuals provided essential context for these discoveries. Her experience with similar cases had demonstrated that financial desperation could drive people to actions that ordinary circumstances would render unthinkable, particularly when they convinced themselves that their victims deserved punishment for their own moral failures. The psychological profile that emerged from their combined analysis revealed a man whose initial discovery of the vicar's financial irregularities had gradually transformed from shocked disapproval into calculating exploitation. Mr. Whitmore's position as churchwarden had provided him with both moral justification and practical opportunity for actions that private desperation made increasingly attractive. The particular tragedy, Miss Marple observed sadly, lies in the way that one person's moral failure can corrupt others who might otherwise have remained quite honourable. Poor Mr. Whitmore's financial difficulties created vulnerabilities that the vicar's misconduct made exploitable. Their investigation had revealed not merely the technical solution to an apparently impossible crime, but the complex web of human weakness and moral compromise that had made such desperate measures seem necessary to the perpetrator. The case demonstrated how individual failures could create circumstances that challenged the fundamental bonds of community trust. Inspector Hartwell's appreciation for these psychological complexities marked a significant development in her professional methodology. Her systematic approach to criminal investigation had been enhanced by understanding that human motivations often possess subtleties that technical analysis alone could not illuminate. I begin to understand, she reflected thoughtfully, that effective detection requires not merely scientific precision, but genuine insight into how people respond to moral pressure and personal crisis. As their investigation moved towards its inevitable conclusion, both women recognized that their partnership had created something more valuable than the sum of its individual components. They had developed a collaborative approach that combined the rigor of modern forensic science with the wisdom of traditional observation, demonstrating that apparent contradictions between old and new methods could actually represent complementary strengths when properly understood and applied. Chapter 16: False Leads. The morning that was to bring their investigation to what appeared to be its inevitable conclusion dawned with that peculiar quality of light that seemed to promise resolution, whilst concealing unexpected complications beneath its tranquil surface. Miss Marple, adjusting her garden gloves before attending to the late-season roses, reflected that human nature possessed an unfortunate tendency towards deception that often confounded even the most systematic analytical approaches. Inspector Hartwell's arrival at the cottage carried with it an air of professional satisfaction that spoke eloquently of someone who believed herself to be approaching the successful conclusion of a complex case. Her systematic methodology had yielded what appeared to be conclusive evidence against Mr. Geoffrey Whitmore, whilst their combined analysis had provided both motive and means for what had initially seemed an impossible crime. "I believe we have assembled sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges," the inspector announced, settling herself in the comfortable chair that had become her customary place during their morning consultations. The combination of architectural knowledge, financial desperation, and access to the victim's private difficulties creates a compelling case against Whitmore. Miss Marple received this intelligence with the thoughtful attention that significant developments demanded, though something in her manner suggested the gentle reservation that experience had taught her to apply when apparently conclusive solutions presented themselves with excessive tidiness. Her needle moved with measured precision through her embroidery as she considered the various elements that their investigation had revealed. "How very satisfactory, my dear Inspector," she murmured, though her tone carried that subtle quality of qualification that those who knew her well had learned to recognize as significant. Mr. Whitmore certainly possessed both the knowledge and the desperation that such a crime would require. Inspector Hartwell's response revealed the professional confidence that systematic analysis had instilled in her approach to criminal investigation. Her documentation of the case against Whitmore appeared comprehensive and convincing, supported by both technical evidence and psychological analysis that explained his transformation from respected churchwarden to desperate criminal. "The architectural drawings prove his familiarity with a concealed passage," she continued with evident satisfaction, whilst his financial records demonstrate the mounting pressure that would have made the vicar's embezzled funds irresistibly tempting. Yet as their discussion progressed, Miss Marple found herself experiencing that curious sense of unease that had, on previous occasions, alerted her to the presence of complexities that systematic analysis might overlook. Her years of village observation had taught her that human nature rarely manifested itself with the mechanical predictability that theoretical reconstruction sometimes suggested. "I wonder," she ventured with characteristic diffidence, "whether we might benefit from examining certain aspects of Mr. Whitmore's character that seem somewhat inconsistent with the psychological profile our investigation has developed." Inspector Hartwell's eyebrows rose with the sharp attention that had become habitual when Miss Marple offered observations that challenged conventional analysis. The young woman's appreciation for psychological subtleties had grown considerably since their partnership began, teaching her to value intuitive insights even when they contradicted apparently logical conclusions. "Indeed? What particular aspects strike you as inconsistent, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's response drew upon the accumulated wisdom of many years spent observing how individuals responded to moral pressure and financial crisis. Her understanding of Mr. Whitmore's character, developed through decades of village social interaction, suggested certain fundamental qualities that seemed incompatible with the calculated ruthlessness their theoretical reconstruction required. "Well, you see, my dear Inspector, Geoffrey Whitmore has always struck me as rather like my nephew Raymond's friend Henderson. Fundamentally decent, but inclined towards paralysis rather than decisive action when confronted with moral dilemmas, the sort of person who might embezzle gradually through self-deception, but who would find the immediate violence of murder quite beyond his psychological capabilities. This observation resonated with particular significance when considered alongside certain practical elements of the crime that their focus on motive and architectural possibility had somewhat overlooked. The successful exploitation of the concealed chimney passage would have required not merely knowledge of its existence, but considerable physical agility and remarkable sang-froid during the actual commission of the crime. Inspector Hartwell's systematic reconsideration of the physical requirements revealed details that their initial enthusiasm for a comprehensive solution had perhaps minimized. The passage itself, whilst accessible to someone of appropriate size and determination, would have demanded athletic capabilities and nerve that seemed inconsistent with Whitmore's middle-aged constitution and fundamentally timid nature. Most perceptive, the inspector acknowledged with obvious reluctance to abandon what had seemed a satisfactory conclusion. The physical demands of utilising such an unusual means of access would indeed require qualities that Whitmore's general character might not encompass. Their renewed examination of the evidence proceeded with the careful attention that Miss Marple's reservations demanded. Inspector Hartwell's scientific methodology, enhanced now by sensitivity to psychological inconsistencies, revealed gaps in their theoretical reconstruction that enthusiasm for solution had temporarily obscured. The alternative possibilities that emerged from this reconsideration suggested that their investigation had perhaps focused too narrowly upon the obvious combination of motive and architectural knowledge, whilst overlooking other forms of access to both the vicar's secrets and the structural peculiarities that the crime required. "I begin to suspect," Miss Marple observed thoughtfully, "that we may have fallen into the trap of accepting the most apparent solution without sufficient consideration of whether character and capability actually support our logical deductions." Inspector Hartwell's professional honesty compelled her to acknowledge the validity of these concerns, despite her natural desire to proceed with what had seemed a conclusive case. Her appreciation for Miss Marple's psychological insights had taught her that theoretical possibility required confirmation through careful analysis of whether suspected individuals actually possessed the personal qualities that particular crimes demanded. "You suggest that we should expand our investigation beyond Whitmore despite the apparent strength of the circumstantial evidence?" Miss Marple's response carried the gentle persistence that had characterized her approach to previous mysteries when obvious solutions proved inadequate upon closer examination. "I believe, my dear Inspector, that we should at least satisfy ourselves that our current theory accounts for all the psychological and physical requirements that this particular crime encompassed." As the morning progressed, both women found themselves confronting the humbling recognition that systematic analysis, however thorough, remained vulnerable to the subtle deceptions that human nature could employ when circumstances demanded concealment of guilt. Their apparent solution to the locked room mystery might represent merely another layer of misdirection in a case whose complexities had not yet been fully penetrated. Chapter 17. The Breakthrough. The revelation that was to transform their entire understanding of the case arrived with the unexpected suddenness that characterizes the most significant breakthroughs in human detection. Miss Marple, whose afternoon constitutional had taken her past the churchyard where the autumn light cast long shadows across the ancient headstones, found herself pausing before the memorial to the Victorian builders whose work had created the architectural peculiarities that made the vicar's murder possible. Inspector Hartwell's systematic re-examination of the vicarage's structural modifications had proceeded with the methodical precision that marked her most thorough investigations. Her measurements of the concealed chimney passage, enhanced now by careful attention to the physical requirements such access would demand, had revealed details that their initial enthusiasm for solution had perhaps too hastily overlooked. Most illuminating, she declared during their evening consultation in Miss Marple's sitting room, her technical drawings spread across the small table with characteristic precision. The passage itself presents far greater challenges than our theoretical reconstruction initially suggested. Miss Marple's needle moved with steady rhythm through her embroidery as she considered these architectural revelations alongside her own observations of human character under stress. Her reflection upon the specific individuals who possessed both motive and capability had suggested possibilities that systematic analysis alone might not have revealed. Indeed, my dear Inspector, though I have been wondering whether we might have overlooked the significance of certain other forms of architectural knowledge that would prove equally valuable for such an enterprise. The breakthrough came through Miss Marple's particular talent for perceiving connections between apparently disparate elements of village life. Her conversation with young Billy Hargreaves during the morning's garden work had revealed details about the vicarage's maintenance requirements that formal investigation had not considered significant. "Funny thing about that old chimney," Billy had observed with the casual directness characteristic of his practical experience. "Been giving trouble for months, it has. Mrs. Mills mentioned that the sweep had been up there regular-like, trying to sort out the draft problems." This seemingly innocent intelligence, when considered alongside Inspector Hartwell's technical analysis of the architectural modifications, suggested possibilities that their focus upon historical renovation knowledge had entirely missed. The chimney sweep's regular access to the structural peculiarities would have provided intimate familiarity with precisely those features that the crime had exploited. "Most significant," Inspector Hartwell murmured, consulting her careful notes with renewed attention. Professional maintenance would indeed provide the kind of detailed knowledge that such a sophisticated crime required. Miss Marple's understanding of village social dynamics supplied the psychological context that transformed this practical observation into genuine insight. Her years of observing how professional relationships developed within small communities had taught her that service providers often acquired intimate knowledge of their clients' private circumstances through the unconscious confidences that domestic familiarity encouraged. "I have been reflecting upon poor Mr. Clement's habits during his periods of distress," she observed thoughtfully. "When people are troubled, they often seek solitude in their studies, quite unaware that household maintenance might bring others into proximity with their private conversations. The identification of Thomas Higgins, the village chimney sweep, as a potential suspect proceeded with the collaborative efficiency that their partnership had developed. Inspector Hartwell's systematic investigation of his access to both architectural knowledge and private information, combined with Miss Marple's understanding of how financial desperation might corrupt fundamentally decent individuals. The sweep's circumstances, when examined with proper attention to both practical and psychological elements, revealed a pattern that explained both capability and motivation with far greater psychological consistency than their previous theoretical reconstruction. His professional duties had provided intimate knowledge of the vicarage's structural peculiarities, whilst his proximity during the vicar's private moments of distress had yielded awareness of the financial irregularities and blackmail arrangements. "Remarkable," Inspector Hartwell declared, examining the evidence that their renewed investigation had assembled. Higgins possessed not merely architectural knowledge, but the physical capability and professional equipment that such an unusual crime would require. Miss Marple's contribution to understanding the psychological aspects of the case drew upon her extensive experience with individuals whose circumstances had driven them beyond the boundaries of conventional morality. Her analysis of how desperation could corrupt essentially honest people provided the framework for comprehending Higgins's transformation from reliable tradesman to calculating murderer. "The particular tragedy," she observed sadly, "lies in the way that knowledge acquired through honest labour can be corrupted by circumstances that make criminal exploitation seem like the only viable solution to overwhelming difficulties." Inspector Hartwell's technical analysis of how Higgins might have committed the crime proceeded with systematic precision, enhanced by psychological insight. The sweep's professional equipment would have provided everything necessary for navigating the concealed chimney passage, whilst his regular access to the vicarage had yielded opportunities for observing the vicar's habits and planning the optimal moment for action. The method itself becomes quite straightforward once we understand the perpetrator's professional capabilities, the inspector noted with satisfaction. What appeared impossible to conventional analysis proves entirely practical for someone with appropriate technical expertise. Their reconstruction of the crime revealed a plan of remarkable sophistication, masked by apparent simplicity. Higgins had exploited his legitimate access to the vicarage's chimney system to position himself within the concealed passage, waiting for the moment when the vicar's solitary evening work provided optimal circumstances for a confrontation that his victim's weak heart could not survive. Miss Marple's understanding of the psychological dynamics that had driven Higgins to such desperate measures drew upon her observation of how moral boundaries could dissolve when individuals convinced themselves that their actions served higher purposes. The sweep's discovery of the vicar's financial crimes had provided the moral justification that enabled him to proceed with plans that ordinary circumstances would have rendered unthinkable. I suspect, she reflected with characteristic insight, that poor Higgins had convinced himself that he was serving justice rather than committing murder. The vicar's moral failures made him seem deserving of punishment, whilst the financial pressures of his own circumstances made the embezzled church funds irresistibly tempting. The solution to the locked room mystery had emerged through the combination of Inspector Hartwell's technical precision and Miss Marple's psychological understanding, demonstrating once again how their collaborative approach could achieve insights that neither methodology might have accomplished independently. The architectural impossibility had been resolved through recognition that professional access provided capabilities that historical knowledge alone could not encompass. Chapter 18: Confronting the Killer. The confrontation with Thomas Higgins was arranged with the careful precision that such delicate matters demanded, taking place in the vicarage study where the crime itself had been committed. Miss Marple, observing Inspector Hartwell's methodical preparation for what promised to be a most uncomfortable interview, reflected that the exposure of guilt possessed its own particular solemnity, a gravity that transformed even routine police procedure into something approaching a moral reckoning. Inspector Slack's presence lent official weight to the proceedings, though Miss Marple noted with quiet satisfaction that he had positioned himself as a silent observer, rather than attempting to direct the investigation that Inspector Hartwell and she had conducted with such collaborative success. The arrangement spoke well of his professional judgment, recognising as it did that their partnership had achieved insights that conventional methodology might have overlooked. Thomas Higgins arrived with the punctual reliability that had characterised his professional service to the village for more than 2 decades. His bearing carried the particular dignity that honest labour instills in working men, though Miss Marple's experienced eye detected beneath his composed exterior the subtle tension that accompanies guilty knowledge confronting inevitable exposure. Mr. Higgins, Inspector Hartwell began with the professional courtesy that marked her most serious investigations. We should like to discuss with you certain aspects of your recent work at the vicarage, particularly your maintenance of the chimney system that has been giving such persistent difficulties. The sweep's response demonstrated the careful composure of someone who had prepared himself for this moment, whilst hoping it might never arrive. His acknowledgement of his professional duties carried the measured precision of truth carefully limited to avoid more dangerous territories of revelation. "Aye, Inspector, troublesome chimney that one has been. Called me in regular like these past months, Mrs. Mills did, trying to sort the draught problems that were making the study near uninhabitable during the damp weather." Miss Marple observed the subtle interplay of expressions that accompanied this exchange, noting how Higgins's eyes avoided direct contact, whilst his hands displayed the unconscious fidgeting that often betrayed inner turmoil despite outward calm. His responses, whilst factually accurate, possessed that quality of calculated limitation that experience had taught her to recognise as significant. Inspector Hartwell's questioning proceeded with systematic precision, enhanced by psychological sensitivity. Her approach demonstrated the collaborative methodology that their partnership had developed, combining technical analysis with intuitive understanding of human nature under stress. "Your work would have provided you with intimate knowledge of the structural peculiarities that our investigation has revealed," she continued with gentle persistence. "The concealed passage that was created during the Victorian modifications would have been quite apparent to someone conducting thorough chimney maintenance." The sweep's acknowledgement of this technical reality marked the first significant breach in his defensive composure. His professional pride compelled honest admission of his expertise, even as such honesty moved him closer to the more dangerous admissions that would inevitably follow. "Well, Naturally, Inspector, can't do proper maintenance without understanding the full structure of what you're working with. Those Victorian builders were clever fellows, created passages and flues that served multiple purposes, though they could be tricky to navigate if you didn't know your way about. Miss Marple's contribution to the developing confrontation drew upon her particular understanding of how moral pressure could corrupt fundamentally decent individuals. Her gentle observations about the psychological burdens that knowledge of wrongdoing could create prepared the ground for more direct revelations about motive and opportunity. "How very trying it must have been," she observed with characteristic sympathy, "to discover through the unavoidable intimacy of household maintenance that someone you respected was involved in such distressing irregularities. The poor vicar's private conversations during his periods of distress would have been quite audible to someone working in the chimney system." This psychological insight struck home with visible effect. Higgins's carefully maintained composure wavered as Miss Marple's gentle words acknowledged the moral complexity of his situation, whilst implicitly recognising his knowledge of the vicar's crimes. "Terrible thing to discover about a man of God," he admitted with obvious difficulty. "Heard him talking to himself, I did, working through his accounts and fretting about debts that seemed to grow worse each month. Made my blood run cold, it did, learning how he'd been taking from the church funds." Inspector Hartwell's systematic presentation of the physical evidence proceeded with methodical precision, enhanced by understanding of the psychological pressures that had driven Higgins to desperate measures. Her documentation of his access to both architectural knowledge and private information created an inexorable framework that made denial increasingly difficult to maintain. "Your professional equipment would have provided everything necessary for navigating the concealed passage," she observed with professional directness. "The ropes, lighting and climbing apparatus that chimney maintenance requires would have made what appeared impossible to others entirely practical for someone with your expertise." The sweep's responses revealed the particular anguish of someone whose honest skills had been corrupted by circumstances beyond his normal experience. His admission of capability came with obvious reluctance, each technical detail bringing him closer to the moral precipice that complete confession represented. Miss Marple's final psychological insight addressed the fundamental question of motivation that technical evidence alone could not illuminate. Her understanding of how financial desperation could transform moral indignation into criminal justification provided the framework for comprehending Higgins's ultimate decision to exploit his professional access for murderous purposes. "I suspect," she observed with gentle penetration, "that your own financial difficulties, combined with knowledge of the vicar's embezzlement, created circumstances where taking action seemed not merely justified, but morally necessary. The church funds that he had stolen would have resolved your pressing debts while serving what appeared to be righteous justice." This psychological reconstruction proved devastatingly accurate. Higgins's remaining composure crumbled as Miss Marple's gentle words acknowledged both his desperate circumstances and the moral framework he had constructed to justify actions that ordinary conscience would have forbidden. "He was stealing from the church while good honest folk struggled to pay their tithes," he confessed with bitter anguish. "My wife's medical bills mounting every week, and there he was taking money that belonged to God's work. Seemed like providence itself when I realised that his weak heart might not survive the shock of being confronted with his crimes by someone who knew the full extent of his wrongdoing." Inspector Hartwell's careful documentation of this confession proceeded with the professional thoroughness that such admissions required, whilst Inspector Slack's formal arrest carried the weight of legal authority that transformed moral reckoning into criminal justice. The successful resolution of the locked room mystery had emerged through the collaborative application of technical analysis and psychological insight, demonstrating once again how their partnership could achieve understanding that neither approach might have accomplished independently. Chapter 19, Justice Served. The formal conclusion of the case against Thomas Higgins proceeded with the measured dignity that English justice demanded. Though Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the profound sadness that accompanied even the most necessary prosecutions, the machinery of law however essential for maintaining civilized order, possessed an inexorable quality that transformed human tragedy into administrative procedure, a transformation that served society's needs whilst perhaps diminishing appreciation for the complex moral circumstances that had driven fundamentally decent individuals beyond the boundaries of acceptable behaviour. Inspector Hartwell's preparation of the evidence for presentation to the magistrates demonstrated the professional thoroughness that had characterised her approach throughout their investigation. Her systematic documentation of both physical evidence and psychological motivation created a comprehensive picture that would serve the requirements of formal justice, whilst preserving the human complexities that their collaborative analysis had revealed. Most satisfactory, Inspector Slack observed during their final consultation at the police station, his tone carrying the particular satisfaction that accompanied the resolution of cases that had initially appeared quite impossible. Your combined methodology has achieved results that conventional investigation might never have accomplished. Miss Marple accepted this recognition with the modest grace that had always characterised her approach to such matters, though she could not entirely suppress a certain melancholy regarding the circumstances that had made their success necessary. The village had gained justice, certainly, but at the cost of destroying lives that different circumstances might have preserved in honour and contentment. The trial itself, conducted at the county assizes with all the ceremony that serious criminal matters demanded, provided a public forum for the careful presentation of evidence that their investigation had assembled. Inspector Hartwell's testimony demonstrated the scientific precision that modern detection could achieve, whilst Miss Marple's observations illuminated the psychological pressures that had transformed honest labour into calculated crime. Thomas Higgins' defence, conducted by counsel, appointed through the good offices of charitable villagers who recognised his fundamental decency, despite his terrible actions, focused upon the extenuating circumstances that had driven him to such desperate measures. His wife's mounting medical expenses, combined with his discovery of clerical corruption that seemed to mock his own honest struggles, had created a moral framework within which violence appeared justified rather than criminal. The judge's summing up reflected the particular wisdom that experience brings to understanding how good people can be corrupted by circumstances beyond their ordinary capacity to bear. His recognition of the genuine tragedy inherent in the case, the destruction of 2 lives through the intersection of moral weakness and financial desperation, provided context for a sentence that acknowledged both the necessity of punishment and the human complexities that had made such punishment inevitable. Miss Marple observed these proceedings from the public gallery with the thoughtful attention that had characterised her approach to all aspects of the case. Her presence served not as mere curiosity about the legal process, but as a form of moral witness to the conclusion of events that had touched the fundamental fabric of village life. Inspector Hartwell's reflection upon their collaborative success carried implications that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of their recent cases. Her appreciation for the complementary nature of their respective approaches had demonstrated how apparent contradictions between traditional wisdom and modern methodology could actually represent enhanced capability when properly understood and applied. "I find myself wondering," she confided to Miss Marple during their walk through the village following the trial's conclusion, "whether the future of effective criminal investigation might lie in precisely such partnerships between scientific analysis and intuitive understanding of human nature." Miss Marple's response drew upon the accumulated wisdom of many years spent observing how social progress manifested itself through the gradual integration of new knowledge with established wisdom. Her experience had taught her that genuine advancement typically emerged through synthesis rather than replacement, through recognition that different approaches to understanding could enhance rather than compete with each other. "How very perceptive of you, my dear Inspector. I have long believed that wisdom lies not in choosing between old and new methods, but in understanding how each contributes essential elements to complete understanding. Your scientific precision provides framework and verification, whilst village observation supplies psychological insight and human context. The recognition that their partnership had established extended beyond their individual satisfaction to encompass broader implications for how complex problems might be approached in an increasingly sophisticated world. Their success had demonstrated that technical expertise, however impressive, required supplementation from alternative forms of understanding when confronting the enduring mysteries of human motivation and behaviour. Inspector Slack's official commendation of their joint efforts reflected institutional acknowledgement that conventional police methodology might benefit from incorporating approaches that had traditionally been dismissed as unscientific or amateurish. The practical success of their collaboration had provided evidence that effective detection required both systematic analysis and intuitive insight into character and motivation. The village itself had emerged from its recent trials with a deeper appreciation for the complex moral pressures that could challenge even the most fundamental community bonds. The revelation of clerical corruption, combined with the tragedy of honest labour corrupted by desperation, had provided sobering education in how individual weakness could create circumstances that threatened the very foundations of social trust. Miss Marple's evening reflections, conducted in the comfortable solitude of her cottage sitting room with her knitting, providing its customary rhythm for contemplation, encompassed both satisfaction at justice achieved and sadness at the human cost such justice had required. The case had demonstrated the effectiveness of combining different analytical approaches, whilst revealing the tragic consequences that moral failure could generate throughout even the most tranquil communities. Inspector Hartwell's decision to remain in St Mary Mead as the local representative of modern police methodology represented recognition that rural communities possessed complexities that required both professional expertise and local understanding. Her partnership with Miss Marple had created a model for detection that honoured both scientific rigour and traditional wisdom, establishing possibilities for future collaboration that promised enhanced capability for maintaining justice and order. The successful resolution of 3 distinct mysteries, the bank robbery, the garden party poisoning, and the locked room murder, had established their partnership as something more than mere professional cooperation. They had created a methodology that combined the best elements of both approaches to human understanding, demonstrating that progress need not require abandonment of established wisdom, but could emerge through its enhancement with new knowledge and technique. Chapter 20. A New Partnership. The autumn morning that marked the formal beginning of their permanent arrangement dawned with that peculiar quality of light that seemed to bless new undertakings whilst preserving the comfortable familiarities that made change acceptable to settled communities. Miss Marple, adjusting the last of her chrysanthemums in the sitting-room window, reflected that life possessed an agreeable tendency to resolve apparent contradictions through the simple expedient of time and mutual understanding. Inspector Hartwell's decision to establish permanent residence in St Mary Mead had been announced through the measured formality that such professional arrangements required, though the underlying satisfaction that accompanied her choice was evident to those who had observed her transformation from metropolitan efficiency to collaborative wisdom. Her cottage, acquired through the good offices of Colonel Bantry, and situated within comfortable walking distance of both the police station and Miss Marple's residence, represented a geographical manifestation of the partnership that their recent successes had established. The village had received this development with the characteristic blend of curiosity and approval that marked its response to changes that promised enhanced, rather than diminished community welfare. Inspector Hartwell's demonstrated competence, enhanced by her appreciation for local knowledge and traditional methods, had earned the sort of respect that professional excellence combined with personal humility invariably commanded. Most satisfactory arrangement, Colonel Bantry had declared during the informal gathering at Gossington Hall that served to welcome the inspector's permanent presence, combines the best of modern police work with proper understanding of village life. Can't ask for better than that. Miss Marple's own satisfaction with these developments reflected recognition that their partnership had evolved beyond mere professional cooperation into something approaching genuine friendship between individuals whose different generations and backgrounds had discovered complementary approaches to understanding human nature. Their collaboration had demonstrated that wisdom could manifest itself through unexpected channels when circumstances encouraged such development. The establishment of their working relationship had been formalized through arrangements that honored both official requirements and practical necessities. Inspector Hartwell would serve as the local representative of County Police Authority, whilst Miss Marple's consultative role, though lacking official recognition, had been quietly acknowledged by those whose opinions carried weight in such matters. Inspector Slack's visit to finalise these arrangements provided official sanction for what village understanding had already accepted as natural and beneficial. His conversation with both ladies, conducted in Miss Marple's sitting room with the comfortable informality that successful partnerships encouraged, reflected institutional recognition that effective detection sometimes required approaches that transcended conventional methodology. "Your recent successes have created considerable interest at headquarters," he confided with obvious satisfaction. "The combination of scientific analysis with local knowledge has achieved results that neither approach might have accomplished independently. Most impressive demonstration of how different methods can enhance, rather than compete with each other." Inspector Hartwell's response to this recognition carried the professional satisfaction of someone whose initial confidence had been tempered by experience into genuine competence enhanced by humility. Her appreciation for Miss Marple's contributions reflected not merely personal gratitude, but institutional understanding that complex problems often required diverse analytical approaches. "I confess myself considerably educated by our collaboration," she acknowledged with characteristic honesty. Miss Marple's understanding of human psychology has revealed aspects of criminal behaviour that purely technical analysis would certainly have overlooked. Our partnership has created capabilities that neither of us possessed individually. Miss Marple accepted these generous observations with the modest grace that had always characterised her approach to recognition, though she could not entirely suppress satisfaction at seeing her methods achieve professional acknowledgement after many years of unofficial application. Her own appreciation for Inspector Hartwell's systematic methodology had demonstrated that traditional wisdom could be enhanced rather than threatened by modern approaches. The practical arrangements that governed their future collaboration reflected careful consideration of how their respective strengths could be most effectively employed. Inspector Hartwell would handle the technical aspects of criminal investigation, forensic analysis, official interviews, coordination with county authorities, whilst Miss Marple would contribute the psychological insights and local knowledge that her years of village observation had developed. Their first joint case under these formal arrangements came sooner than either had anticipated, though its resolution proceeded with the smooth efficiency that their established partnership enabled. A suspicious death at the neighbouring village of Much Benham required investigation that benefited from both scientific analysis and understanding of rural social dynamics, demonstrating once again how their complementary approaches could achieve comprehensive understanding of complex circumstances. The success of this initial collaboration under official auspices confirmed the practical value of their partnership whilst establishing precedents for future cooperation. Inspector Hartwell's systematic documentation provided the framework required for legal proceedings, whilst Miss Marple's insights into character and motivation explained aspects of the case that technical evidence alone could not illuminate. Village life itself had adapted to these developments with the resilient flexibility that characterized healthy communities. The presence of professional police competence, enhanced by traditional wisdom and local knowledge, provided security and confidence that purely technical or purely amateur approaches might not have achieved. St. Mary Mead had acquired something approaching ideal protection against the criminal complexities that modern life could generate. Miss Marple's evening reflections, conducted in the comfortable familiarity of her cottage sitting room, whilst her knitting provided its customary rhythm for contemplation, encompassed both personal satisfaction and broader appreciation for how progress could manifest itself through synthesis rather than replacement. Their partnership represented a model for how different generations and methodologies could enhance each other's capabilities rather than competing for supremacy. Inspector Hartwell's own satisfaction with these arrangements reflected recognition that her professional development had been significantly enhanced by exposure to analytical approaches that police training had not provided. Her systematic methodology, whilst remaining fundamental to effective investigation, had been enriched by understanding of human psychology that village observation had uniquely fostered. The future stretched before them with the promise of continued collaboration in service of justice and community welfare. Their partnership had demonstrated that the apparent contradiction between traditional wisdom and modern technique represented false dichotomy, that genuine progress emerged through integration rather than replacement, through recognition that different approaches to understanding could strengthen rather than compete with each other. As the season turned towards winter and the village settled into the comfortable rhythms that had sustained it through many changes, Miss Marple reflected that life possessed an agreeable tendency to reward those who approached its complexities with both systematic analysis and intuitive understanding, with both professional competence and human sympathy.